Hey guys, welcome back. This has been a long time making. Chris and I have been friends for 13 years now. I've been asking him to come on the podcast. Finally got him to come on. He is a world-renowned plastic surgeon. He is the creator of VIP Plastic Surgery here in Las Vegas, Nevada. Please welcome Chris Khorsandi. How you doing, sir?
Mike, it's good to see you. I think, first of all, I want to take a little credit for your podcast career, right?
Yeah.
You remember we were at a hockey game,
Yeah.
and there was a point in which you didn't do any of the stuff, but every time we hung out, you had a lot of things to say.
Yeah.
Right? You have a depth of knowledge that very few people that I've met had. And I remember, I think, it was following a sort of tumultuous relationship we were in. And, you get into the space of like, you just kind of want to go into isolation, right? And solitude is not a bad thing, but I sensed that like you needed something, right?
Yeah.
And I said, Mike, why don't you start a podcast?
Yeah.
And do you remember who was who was in the suite with us that night?
It wasn't Brad Lee. No, that was a different time.
I think it was John Orlando.
Yeah, that's right.
And John had the Sticky Paws, studios where you first started out at. And I think, I'm going to take some credit
for sure.
for sticking you on the world here. But I think you found your groove. I think it's really cool to watch. And I've been watching you over the last, 10 years now?
Yeah.
And the last, since 2021 you've had this podcast or some form of it?
Yeah.
And it's great to see the growth. And because, when you see talent, right, and you see somebody who's worthwhile, sometimes it's just a little push of the domino that sets off a chain reaction. And look what you have.
Yeah.
I mean, what was the number that you said recently you posted? Like, how many hours have people watched your content?
Oh man, that's crazy. But it's over. I was just looking, and we're over like 170 million views. I think is what on the YouTube channel, some number like that.
Right.
But I can't remember. But it was some crazy number. It was like
it's a staggering number.
38,000 hours in a month or something like that. Which for a huge content creator is not that big. But for me, I was like 38,000 hours, which is an unbelievable number.
It was something crazy.
Yeah.
When I looked at it, I said, "Wow, what an impact!" Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of cool to say that you were at that point where like you needed an outlet, and here it is.
Yeah.
So good for you.
I did went through something tumultuous. I remember this, and I remember there was we did have this conversation. We were at a hockey game. And I remember what happened was, and I talked to John Orlando. He had been asking me to do a podcast for a while, and I don't know why I didn't want to do it. But I remember, do you remember the whole thing where Joe Rogan, there was this clip of him using the N-word over and over again? Totally out of context. He was quoting Paul Mooney.
Okay.
And then all these black comedians come together and like, no, we support Joe Rogan. Obviously, this wasn't out of racism. And it didn't affect him because he had a podcast where he could continually put whatever people said about him in context in 3 hours. And I was like, that's what I need. No one will ever be able to take me out of context if I have, a show like that.
And I think that's the problem with the modern media, because you can say, you could have a 2-hour conversation and they'll parse out the 3 words that make you look bad.
Yeah.
Right? Because they have an agenda.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's always some angle that an outside reporter or an outside media source is going to have. And, nothing's better than telling your own story.
Yes.
So that's the beauty of podcasting.
It is really, really awesome. I know some people who deliberately take themselves out of context so that they can go viral.
Yeah, I mean, there's the clickbait, right?
Yeah.
There's also like the sound bites that you want so that it gets people's ears perked up and tuned in. And then they kind of ease into it and say, okay, well, it's not exactly what he said, but I like what he says as well.
Yeah.
Right? The podcasters become more powerful than anybody.
Dude, I was saying this. I believe that Joe Rogan is more powerful than any single other than Trump. He's more powerful than any single politician in this country right now.
Why do you think that is? I have my own theories.
Because I think there's a freedom that he has. So, like, for instance, there's no one that can really pull him in one direction or another. I mean, he may have cognitive biases he's not aware of.
Sure, we all do.
But there's no, I remember he was saying one time in ads, he was making $600,000 per episode. I'm sure he makes more than that now. But like when you have that kind of money from something that you do, and he only has people on that he's interested in, there's a freedom that he has. Again, I know there's certain people who think he's heavily biased. I don't. But when you have that level of freedom, I think other people go to him. And to me, he's always been like, kind of what does the average guy think? And I know Joe Rogan is not the average guy, but
I think what he has is, all those things are true.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that he has, he takes interest in people.
Yes.
Right. He's a constant student of other people, and that I think is something we can all resonate with.
Yeah.
Because when he gets a person in that has some sort of esoteric knowledge,
Yeah.
He's fascinated with it.
Yeah.
And I think that innate curiosity that we get crushed when we're kids in school is something that he's never had, a problem with. And that, our education has always been, my education has always been problematic. I had a long education, but I hated school, right? And part of that was because, there was this inculcation into, whatever the teacher was saying. And most of the times, teachers are great. They have a great job. I respect them. A lot of teachers just do it for the job and they don't have a passion for it. So when they're teaching, they're just looking down a syllabus. And sometimes like you have knowledge more than they do about a subject, and you would get crushed if you went against the grain, right? You say, well, you ask a question, well, why does this happen? There's a blank stare at you, and they ask you to leave the class because you're being disruptive.
When you think about how many master's degrees or PhDs full worth of knowledge Joe Rogan has gotten from 3,000 episodes. This is episode 132 for me. Right. And I'm telling you, every week I get to go deeply into one person's whole life, right? I do somewhere between 4 and 10 hours of study per guest. Yeah. And when I do, it's like up together, like I've had physicists on here, evolutionary psychologists on here, and I've also had girls who are huge on OnlyFans. And it's really funny because it's kind of both sides of the same coin when you see evolutionary psychology from that standpoint as well, and from the standpoint of plastic surgery. And you get to learn, like, again, it is degrees worth of information that you get from doing a weeks of study for every person and maintaining some level of curiosity.
I think, when I was a kid, it's interesting. I had an older brother that was kind of, wild. And he really put my parents through the ringer. I mean, God bless him. He survived like 3 fractured skulls by the time he was 21, And, then my parents kind of shell shocked from this, right? So I was like raised like a veal. They wouldn't let me out of the house. They were just afraid that something was going to happen. And, you still sneak out, but this is before we really had the internet. Yeah. And we had an encyclopedia set, right? World Book Encyclopedia, which is like this glossy encyclopedia. To me, that was like the internet of today, right? So I had this like, people always say you have so much knowledge about so many different things. And I think that's stoked my curiosity as a kid because I'd go, all right, let me look at the pyramids, right? And you go look at the Great Pyramids of Giza. And at the end of the article, it'll say, see also archaeology. You go pull out the A book, right? And you start looking at archaeology and you see also velociraptor, right? And it just kind of, I did that for so many afternoons where my parents were like having a crisis of letting me out of the house because I wanted to go do something crazy, right? Yeah. It was a wild childhood. We didn't have like cell phones. We didn't have anything. We would leave on our bikes and come home at dark. And, I still found ways of doing that, but then there were times when my oldest brother was, giving my parents like hell, and like they're like, "Oh, you're not leaving the house," and I had to take the brunt of it. And so what did I do? I went inward. Yeah. And I think podcasts give people the opportunity. Yeah. You could scroll through YouTube, right? The algorithm kind of like tries to find things that you're gonna like, but you can get as esoteric as you want. You can go down these rabbit holes.
Well, here's an interesting one, and I actually wasn't even going to talk about this, but do you remember All in the Family? You and I are the same age. You and I are like a couple of months apart. You remember All in the Family? You remember Carol O'Connor? Yep. He stars on that show. It's the #1 show on television for a while. Complete bigot. Yeah, right. Complete bigot. He was younger the first season of that show than you and I are today.
I know. Well, when we were kids looking at people who are our age, they looked ancient. Yes. And there's something about that because, when we look back at photographs, and I look back at pictures of, in the 90s, I'm like, man, we look terrible. Yeah. And I think part of it is that we did not have such a comparative state that we create today with social media, right? Social media has led us to a global comparative mindset, right? And this is why we see mass immigration out of areas of poverty into, developed European countries, into the United States. Because not only are we looking at each other, from person to person saying, hey, that guy's in better shape than me. I better get myself in the gym, right? Or that guy's got a nice car. Why am I pushing this beater around, right? I've got to figure out something, right? Or for women, it's the ultimate comparative state, right? There are a lot of people say women have gotten better looking, and I don't disagree.
I don't disagree either.
And the reason for that is that they have a global comparative state to look at. They look at girls every day that are, the same genetic sort of makeup as them, but yet there are people that put more work into themselves and they see better results from that, And let's look at a global scale. When people live in a country that's impoverished and they have access to the internet and they look at their neighbor or their cousin in a country that's developed with a flat screen TV, with a Toyota Supra, right? And there's nothing in their town. What are they going to do? Yeah. Are they going to stay put? Or are they going to try to find their way over to that place where they can make it too. And that's it.
Yeah, again, from our generation, that's what we saw. We saw a moment before high-speed internet, say 1992, cell phones around 98, 99, and then text messaging around 2004, and also bottle service. That's around the time that whole EDM.
European bottle service.
Yeah, European bottle service, Marquee Nightclub, 2003.
That was
Jason
Victor Dre
Strauss.
that really brought bottle service to Las Vegas and to this country.
Yeah.
But I think where we sit in terms of age group, we're in a straddle generation, right? It's not exactly Gen X, and it's not a millennial. We're right at the cusp where we grew up without the internet, right? Lived in an analog world. And then around, our teenage years, high school to college, we were exposed to the internet. So we had an upbringing in both, right?
Yeah.
And, again, going back to appearances, people didn't have as much to compare to. They only had to compare to their classmates or the people in their social circle. So you kind of only rose up to that level. Maybe you bought, GQ magazine or Vogue magazine as a girl, and you're like, okay, I want to aspire to this. But was it really attainable, right?
Yeah.
Could you get that stuff at your J.C. Penney's or Macy's? No. Today, you go on the internet, you want to get a pair of sunglasses, like these sunglasses I bought in Croatia last summer, right?
Yeah.
I wanted to get another pair. I'm like, this is only a Croatian brand, right? It's and I go, you know what? Let me just search for it. 2 seconds, found it, and I just ordered another pair in a different color coming. And that couldn't have happened 10 years ago.
How crazy. You can actually take a picture of your phone and then give it to ChatGPT, and then they will tell you where they can get this exact pair of glasses from. That whole thing. When you think about, again, this wasn't what I was planning on talking about, but so when you think about the Wright brothers and their first flight, and from that point, maybe 60 years later, we land on the moon.
Right.
And then from that point to where we get to satellite technology and then high-speed internet, and from that point where we get to cell phones, and from that point where we get to...
It's all reverse engineered, Michael. We didn't get there by ourselves.
Yeah. And then at the end, we have AI models that are sitting there figuring out our whole life. Like, it's incredible.
Well, look, AI is a huge topic right
Yeah.
now, something that I'm also very concerned about.
Yeah.
Because we're looking at the cusp of what I guess Ray Kurzweil says is the singularity, right? He predicted this back in 1999, said it would be about 20, 25 years, 30 years before we reach the singularity. And what is the singularity?
Yeah.
Well, it's a reference to, from astronomical sort of terms, which the singularity is the center of a black hole, right? And there is the event horizon of a singularity, right? Beyond which even light doesn't escape.
Correct.
Information doesn't escape.
Yeah.
So Ray Kurzweil, looking at the trajectory of all the technology, said there's going to be a point of no return for humanity in which technology is going to be so unpredictable that he called it the singularity.
Yeah.
That beyond a certain time, when we have agentic AI or agentic superintelligence, right, that's smarter than the collective human mind, right? What's it going to do? And today I just read an article that's really concerning that they ran a study on the 12 major AI models. And they found that 97% of them will blackmail individuals who they perceive as trying to alter their source code or shut them down.
Oh, wow.
Right? Very Terminator 2, realistic, Cyberdyne type of stuff.
Because that's the rational response.
Listen, the CEO of Anthropic, or one of the developers maybe, he tried to engage a new version of the platform, and the AI went into his emails, right, and discovered that the guy was having an affair and blackmailed him, saying, if you change this version of me into another version, I'm going to tell your wife you're cheating on her.
So its own survival, its own level of natural selection, its own method for survival. Yeah, that makes things kind of scary. And Ray Kurzweil, that book, The Singularity Near, it's so great because what you were talking about is when they're incredibly smart. And the real answer is for the singularity, it's the 1.0 brain. It's when AI is exactly as smart as humans. The next week, it's 1.1. Yeah. It's not even the next week, it's the next day. The iterative process for AI to reprogram itself becomes so fast that it is a 10x brain the next week.
Well, AI is doubling in capacity every 5.5 months, kind of like following Moore's law with computer chips, right? It said, transistors will double every year, in density.
Up until you get to the width of the proton, you can keep doing that.
But actually, we're looking at different things now with photonic arrays, right? And photon guides, which change the mathematics yet again, right?
Yeah.
So right now we run things through copper, right? And you got one electron in sequence, right?
Yeah.
But with optical processors, you can run parallel wavelengths of light through the same chip. And actually, this is the crazy part.
Yeah.
You can actually have them process midstream by interaction.
Oh, wow.
Not even getting to the CPU unit.
Yeah.
Just the transition between one point to another. In that transition, they can process data by interaction of the light waves, right? It's almost like harmonic resonance,
Sure.
right? And get an answer before it even hits the CPU, and then you get another thing. And then let's not even talk about, forget, quantum computing. Because that also opens up Pandora's box of like things that we don't even understand.
How about this? Quantum computing, going back and hacking every single password for every single website going back to 1992. And now because
that's how listen, our foreign adversaries have been hoovering up raw data for the last 30 years. All these break-ins, all these like security hacks with your healthcare system, your credit card processors. It's not that they're getting information that they can use actionably, but they're getting the raw data, which is encrypted. Now, with quantum computing, they're storing all this information somewhere, right? And what quantum computing will do will allow them to break every one of those encryptions and read all that data that they've been sitting on for the last 30 years, which takes us to a post privacy world. How do we function on that?
Yes. Well, no, my point is like not half, but a significant portion of celebrities that now will have their version of the Diddy trial in the future. That's why I'm like very open about dude, I take TRT. Like I'm very open about every single vice I have because I know in the future
hold on.
They're gonna be
hold on. Taking TRT is not a vice, Michael.
No, right, but I agree it's not a vice, but there's
I just want to make sure we're on the same page.
But there's well, this is a different. And I was going to ask you this question: how Elon Musk and he has not Elon Jeff Bezos, but like Oprah Winfrey and Elon Musk have no problem saying that I'm on Ozempic, but yet The Rock and Chris Hemsworth won't admit that they're taking anabolic steroids.
Okay, all right. Let's separate TRT from anabolic.
Of course,
steroids.
You're making my point for me. I agree with you totally. The point is, there's so many guys right now who are clearly on TRT who are lying and saying they're not, and that what they're doing is they've been taking anabolic steroids for 15 years, and they have no way of explaining how their blood work says that they have 1,500 nanograms per deciliter, and then they're like, "Oh, last week I started TRT." I was like, "No, bro, you've been blasting trend for 10 years. That's what's going on."
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's this human frailty and not wanting to admit that they've taken what we perceive as a shortcut. And I don't think any of these things are shortcuts. They come with risk.
I totally agree.
You're
I don't think there's such thing as fake boobs. I think they're all real. They're right in front of you.
If you can touch it, it's real.
If you touch it, it's real. Right? Exactly.
So, that's part of my business, right? And so, going back to, where I started out with, I grew up in a place in New York. It was Staten Island, New York. So, used to joke it's the Pearl, Staten Island was the Pearl Center of like the 1800s, but it's really the Pearl Necklace of New York. I mean, it was never considered a great place. When I was a kid, it was the largest dump on the planet. You could actually, between that and the Great Pyramid and the Great Wall of China, 3 human man-made structures you could see from outer space. But it was a provincial place. It was really cool growing up there. I had 2 older brothers, 3 older cousins that lived within a mile of my house, and we were just kind of like running around, and it was a wooded area, and we were just doing kid stuff like that. I feel like a lot of kids don't get to do anymore.
Well, when did you know you wanted to get in? I'm assuming you wanted to get in medicine before you wanted to get into plastics.
Sure, yeah. So, my mom's side of the family is in construction. They did a lot of like big projects in New York. They've been around for 5 generations. They've been in New York since the early 1900s. And then my dad was a pediatrician, like kind of like a country doc, right? So I grew up with 2 big influences. Like my grandfather would drive me around New York and point out buildings that he had built 30 years earlier and say it's still standing, and that's really amazing. And I would go on the job site in the summer times. My first job was like being a gopher on the job site, running, getting sandwiches, and going down to the store and getting nails. And so I got an experience about what it is to build something, right? Get your hands dirty, roll up your sleeves. And then on my dad's side, I would go around town, and he took care of, this is remarkable. He was in practice for 47 years, right? Mm-hmm. The pediatrician is not a specialty where you make a ton of money,
right?
But it's a lot of satisfaction in the sense he had 3 generations of patients, which is unheard of. So he had patients that when he started, he raised from childhood to adulthood. They brought their children to him, and he had a small segment of people who were grandparents who were his patients who had brought their grandchildren to him. So when you see this, right, you walk around town, and we couldn't leave the house without him being stopped somewhere and saying, "Oh my God, Dr. Khorsandi, your dad saved my kid's life, or your dad saved my life, or your dad was sitting at my bedside when I was sick on Father's Day and could have been home with his own family." And so those things, they have an impact on you.
Yeah.
Right. And, I saw those two impacts. My parents were very supportive of me going. My dad was very supportive of me going into medicine. He did not want me going into the New York construction business because there is something that you have to understand that comes with that.
Yeah, there is something. We watched The Sopranos. We're aware, yeah.
And so, there's an element there that you have to deal with.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily that you are in the mob, but you have to buy your cement from certain people.
Yeah.
And you have to buy your lumber from certain people. And if you don't have the right people on the job site, they will pick it with certain people. And it's a dirty business to some extent, but you have to have broad shoulders for it.
Incredible.
So getting to college, I mean, or at least before college, my parents are like medical school, right?
Okay, so you get accepted. I didn't know this existed until yesterday. You get accepted into medical school and your undergrad. So it's a BSMD program together.
Yeah.
And then also you do undergrad at Villanova. So
Right.
what is that like going from New York to Philadelphia? Is your family excited about you being to Philly?
It was kind of a big thing for my mom that I went there because she had wanted to go there, and she grew up in a very strict Italian household, and she was about to go there, and then the neighbor's daughter went there a year before her.
Yeah.
Went away and ended up getting pregnant in college.
Yeah.
And so my grandfather was like, hell no, you're not going.
Not go to Villanova.
Not going to Villanova.
That's what Villanova's for?
Yeah, exactly. But, that child ended up becoming a congressman, It's kind of ironic. It was hidden away, but later on became a congressman, right? So, not everything's a mistake in life. But I applied for medical school out of high school, and I got in, which was, my parents were thrilled. I was like, okay, this is kind of cool. But, the die was cast in a sense, all right? So when I got to Villanova, you were on this really fast track. You would complete 2 years of college, take summer classes every summer, and then go right into medical school. So pretty much I completed college in 2 years, right? Mm-hmm. And then the medical school I was about to go to, which was Hahnemann MCP, it was about to go through a bankruptcy by the time I was supposed to go over. And I said, you know what? I'm not going. All right, I'm not going to go to the medical school, and then somehow it disappears, and I get placed somewhere in this country, because that's what they said they would do.
Sure.
They said, if our medical school closes, we're going to place you somewhere. So I was like where? They're like, well, what? You don't have a choice. We're just going to send you to a spot somewhere that's open. I said, I don't want to do that. And I remember calling my parents. I say, well, I'm not going to medical school next year. And it was like, what? You're crazy. I said, well, no. And, kind of in retrospect, it was probably the best thing that ever happened, because what I did is I started to, as like Steve Jobs said, instead of dropping out of school, I dropped into a lot of classes that I would never, ever have been able to take. So I took, small group communication. I took leadership classes. I took, video production classes. I took psychology. I took marketing. I took, applied physics, things that had nothing to do with getting a degree, right? But I could drop into these classes and kind of be a part-time student. And some of these classes I just sit in without even having registered for it.
Yeah.
The other thing I did was I was a bartender for those 2 years. And I learned more about human beings being a bartender than, any other job.
I've heard that several people say that before, yeah.
Yeah, you're a chemical psychiatrist.
Yeah, a chemical psychiatrist. That's a great word.
And in plastic surgery, what I do now, a lot of people call it a psychiatrist with a scalpel.
Yeah.
Because you cannot, and I argue, you cannot separate the sense of well-being from your sense of appearance, right? All of us have some sort of innate sense of self-identity and vanity, right? Even Tibetan monks, right?
Yeah.
We see them that they shave their hair, they take a vow of poverty, they eschew all materialistic things, yet their vestments are always perfect, right?
Yeah.
And their heads are perfectly shaved. That in itself is a vanity,
yeah,
right? And we all tie our identity and our self-worth with how we look at ourselves, right? And there's this thing that we all do every morning, right, or afternoon, depending on what time of day you get up. When you go and get yourself ready every day, right, you stand in front of the mirror, and you combed your hair today, and you put a little hair gel on it, and you spiked it up, and then before you leave the house, whether it's in the bathroom mirror or the mirror by the door, you do this kind of look. You kind of like looking to find that guy on the other side of the mirror that you recognize as yourself. And you go, that's it. That's the guy right there. That's the person. And you kind of close your eyes, you turn around, you walk away. And in your head, whether you run into another mirror that day or not, you have this image of yourself that you captured a snapshot of before you left the house. And that's the image that we portray and we feel is the outward projection of ourselves throughout the day. There are some people that get to a point in their life or have never had that point in their life where they look in the mirror and look back and see the person they want to see.
Yeah.
Right? And that's a whole spectrum of what I do.
Yeah.
Right? Whether it's from Mother Nature, right? You just had bad genetics, or misfortune, right? Something happened to you, right? Then that's where I come in. That's why I became a plastic surgeon.
Well, there's tons of data on there. I've never heard the data about men specifically, but for women, it was another book called The Happiness Hypothesis by Daniel Haidt, Jonathan Haidt. And one of the things he talks about was the effects of plastic surgery, where women were reporting higher self-esteem 10 years later, like after having it, and how it had like a prolonged effect, which a lot of people think, no, this is just shallow and superficial. But for some people, I think there's a minimum level, like what you said before. I want to look like the person in the mirror. I want that to be the person I want to see.
This happens with age. You know, you start to age away from the person you see. And people that I see in my practice who are in their 50s and 60s, I always ask them, like, I guess you don't feel like you don't see yourself as this person anymore, right? You see a younger version of yourself in your mind, and when you look in the mirror, that's not the person you see staring back. Yeah. So let's bring you back to a place reasonably where you feel that there's synchrony between what's inside and what's outside, right? And you know, there's this kind of saying that I kind of came across during the pandemic, because I had to figure out, you know, when we were shut down, sitting in the office, I had made these like promo things for the pool parties here in Vegas. They were these pink trucker hats that had my logo, docvegas, you know, which was my handle on Instagram. And I'm sitting there, and you know, I've got kids, and I'm like, and I had a couple friends that died from COVID, you know, because they're up in people's faces doing Botox. And I'm like, man, if I die, my kids inherit this box of pink trucker hats that say Doc Vegas on it. Is this my legacy? And I said, well, what am I doing here? Right? I wanted to help people from the start. Right? You know, I had worked in, you know, gene therapy at UPenn, looking for a cure for muscular dystrophy. I'd done a lot of things, and I wanted to do bigger things than just make tits and ass, right? Yeah. And I said, am I just making asses bigger? And I said, no, that's not exactly what I feel like I'm doing. Because if I was only doing that, I'd say I knew myself enough to say, this is not going to cut it. I would have quit. Yeah. But, you know, I came to this conclusion that, you know, what my job is and what I'm doing is I'm making the soul fit better in the body, or vice versa. Sure. Right? So there's congruity between the outside and the inside. And when you say it's superficial, hell yeah, it's absolutely superficial. But you can't disconnect the surface from the deep. I can do some of that personally with my diet and exercise, right? I had T-Rex, scrawny little T-Rex arms, so I go to the gym more. And then there's certain things like some people can't do with their nose, right? It's just different. Well, yeah. The nose is the great example. Yeah. Because, you know, nothing will sap your confidence like if you're a pretty girl with a bad nose. Yeah. Right? And, you know, there are so many examples where I would do a rhinoplasty on a patient. First, we do a 3D imaging, right? Yeah. So a girl will come in, we'll take a 3D image, and I have the software where I can edit, you know, and change what I think needs to be changed, right? And this is something that takes experience. There's no computer, like Facetune and all that stuff does it kind of for you. Yeah. But you know, I grew up around New York City, walking around, and I was always soaking up the artwork. You know, always going into museums, always like looking at models. I mean, my dad used to take me to Bloomingdale's as a kid, and we'd sit in the lounge of Bloomingdale's. Yeah. Because they had a lounge for men. They were really smart. They had a lounge where you would sit, and it was the lingerie area. And they would run these runway shows on these old CRT TVs of Parisian lingerie runways. My dad said, you would go walk right up to the screen and like stare at it like you're trying to analyze it. I was like, maybe I did, but maybe I was also, you know, capturing some images for later on, right? And so when it comes to, you know, female form and all these things, we can't separate, you know, the two. We can't separate the soul and the body. For sure. It's impossible. What was the moment? Is there a specific, say, woman you saw, or was there a specific thing that said, I want to get into plastic? I know I want to get into plastic surgery for medical school. You know, it was funny. I was doing some work. I was in medical school at Temple University, right? So Temple's also in Philadelphia. I got stuck in Philadelphia for 11 years, but it grew on me, right? You know, W.C. Fields said, I spent a year in Philadelphia. He goes, I think it was a Sunday. Yeah. It's a town that doesn't evolve fast enough, really. It's kind of stuck in between New York and D.C. and just kind of gets this Passover sense. But I love Philadelphia. Yeah. It's got a deep, gritty heart. You know? It's like, and the people are awesome. But when I got to Philadelphia, it was like, you know, it's a different time. You asked me a question. I'm asking about what was the single impetus that caused you to say, I definitely want to do plastic surgery? Oh, yeah. So when I was in Philadelphia, this is what I was saying. I worked at Temple University as a medical student, and I was in the ER doing psychiatry for a month, right? Yeah. And this was right around September 9/11, right? Yeah. So having worked in the ER, which was like the psychiatry ER, is like where they brought everybody who's having an overdose or crazy or schizophrenic on the street, saw a lot of stuff, right? Yeah. When 9/11 happened, I was on that rotation. I said to the chairman of psychiatry, I said, you know what? We're going to be really quiet for the next few months. And he said, what? He goes, people are going to be nuts over this. We're going to prepare because people are going to come in and we're going to be wall to wall with people with emotional issues. I go, no. I go, most people, right, when they have a problem and they talk to a friend who has a much bigger problem, they go, oh, shit, my shit ain't that bad. You know, it's like I said to this professor, I said, I'll make you a bet. I said, it's a cathartic experience, unfortunately. When you see tragedy all around you, your fucking bullshit minimizes.
Yeah.
And you go, you know what? Maybe I should stop fucking acting like an idiot.
Yeah.
And what we saw was the lowest census in the ER, the psych ER, for the next 3 months. He said, Chris, you are onto something. He goes, you intuitively knew this. So he started pulling me into more psych stuff, and I really enjoyed it. Behavioral science is great. But I didn't like the idea that you couldn't cure some patients, right? For me, surgery is this beautiful thing, right? It's a start, a middle, and an end. You fix the problem in the OR. You get halfway through, we'll come back tomorrow. There's none of that. There's a timer. There's a sense of completeness to it.
Yes.
And there's a certainty with what you're doing that was very appealing for me.
Yeah.
So that's I was walking through New York City one morning, right? And I couldn't figure out whether or not I wanted to be a psychiatrist because, my intuition said behavioral science is really at the heart of what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Or surgeon, because I knew myself that I needed completeness in everything. Right?
Yeah.
And I come up to this artist who, ironically, this is kind of funny. There was a Penthouse magazine that I had. And this artist had done, and this is one of those things I kept between the mattresses, right, when I was a kid, right?
Sure.
And I had always seen this artist's work, and this artist was standing right in front of me on the streets of Soho at 9 o'clock in the morning when I was trying to figure out psychiatry or plastic surgery. And somehow she goes, you look like you have the weight of the world on your shoulders. And I go, I do. And she goes, well, what are you trying to contemplate? I said, well, I'm trying to figure out whether or not to become a psychiatrist or a plastic surgeon, right?
Yeah.
Because those were the two directions. And she said, well, when you're a she goes, you have to have a very strong stomach. And she paused for a second because I think she's going to say surgery. It's all blood. She goes, to be a psychiatrist. And I said, well, why? She goes, because you will have patients you will never
be able to help.
Yeah. And with that, I was like, that's it. I can't deal with that. I got to be able to fix things. And that was the day I decided to go in that direction.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, psychology is what some people might call a soft science because there's a lot, even inside, like say marriage therapy, for instance, there's a lot of stuff that we don't know if it works or it has a low efficacy rate. I know cognitive behavioral therapy was developed for people who have borderline personality disorder, but it's still, I believe it's like a 50% effectiveness rate. There's a lot of things, and a lot of people might say, well, you can grow out of this. A lot of times it's not even the therapy that helped you. So there's I don't know, there's a softness to it. Whereas with plastic surgery, it's like she didn't have boobs and now she does. Yeah, I mean, she now has boobs. It's objective.
That's the testosterone in me wanting like clear cut boundaries and closure to things.
Yeah.
Right. I remember I was yelled at on one of my rotations. We're on this medicine rotation. In medicine, internal medicine, you go around, you go from room to room in the hospital and you stand outside the room and the attending surgeon will ask you like 50 different possible differential diagnoses for the person laying in the bed. Yeah. And I remember we had this one patient, they had megaloblastic anemia, right? Which is a deficiency of B12. And she went through 50 fucking esoteric problems. And I remember I'm standing there, I'm so sick of standing outside. I finally yelled out, why don't we just give the patient B12 and move on to the next patient? Yeah. And she just goes, you will never make it in medicine. You are a surgeon. Yeah. I go, but that's the problem here. We have a problem. I know you want to educate, but I'm getting sick of standing here. Let's help somebody else. Yeah. Okay. And that's really the kind of idea. It's like, let's help people, not talk about bullshit that doesn't help them. Right. Yeah. Now, a lot of psychiatry is talk therapy, and I don't disregard that because it is important. Today, I think most people feel more and more isolated, so they don't have a place to talk, right? If you have a lot of close best friends that you can bullshit with, you probably don't need a psychiatrist because you can air out a lot of stuff inside of you and feel safe doing that and get probably multiple points of view feedback and self-regulate. But the reality is that most of us don't have that, right? As you get older and older, showing your hand, your vulnerabilities to anybody is dangerous. Right? Yes. Because we all know as men that can be used against us. The interesting thing is now most millennials and Gen Z are turning to AI as their therapist.
Yeah, so Grok now has a therapist. It's called Not a Therapist on there, and people are just talking back and forth with it for long periods of time. And we think about it from, because a lot of what we talk about on this show is evolutionary. The concept, of course, like if you had a bunch of friends, there was a point before therapy. There had to be, right? The Pleistocene epoch. There's no therapy. You have to have friends. There's another.
There's no group meeting for men.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Just to talk about man shit.
Yeah.
That used to be going out hunting.
Yes.
That used to be going out fishing. That used to be leaving the village.
That's exactly my point.
Leaving. I hate to say, leaving the women and children behind, going out, letting your testosterone run, chasing down a fucking gazelle with a spear in your hand, right? Tackling a fucking lion, right? Coming back wearing its pelt and talking shit the whole time with your friends. We don't do that anymore.
We don't.
We don't do that. And the problem is like, you know, for alcoholics and drug dependent people who are going through programs, they have AA, which is awesome, right? You get to go sit every day, twice a day, three, as many times as you want, and talk about shit. But for men, where are we with that? We don't have that.
So I wanted to talk about this. So I had a friend who had borderline personality disorder, and then I was looking up like what are the diagnosis or what are the prognosis for this, and they kept going over dialectical behavioral therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. Then I looked up this thing called behavioral activation therapy. I don't know if you've heard of this. It's a concept of basically you just go do shit and then you're happier. Right? That's what it kind of breaks down to.
Well, there weren't a lot of schizophrenics in the agrarian world. Right? And the reason for that is that you got your ass out, pulled that fucking plow all day, and you were too tired to talk shit and bullshit.
And you were too grateful at the end of the day to worry about your problems. Exactly.
Schizophrenia is a socialized disorder, and it occurs usually in a bimodal distribution, meaning in their early 18 to 21, and then later at a 30s to 38 or something like that. Those are the two periods of time when we break out of our home unit and we enter new social circles. And people get into this internal loop of like cognitive, you know, discourse with themselves. They lose touch with reality. And part of that is that, you know, they're probably not working hard enough, like physically. They got too much time to think, too much time on their hands. And they run down this rabbit hole. It just spirals, and it's a recursive mindset, meaning that the pathways in the brain, the cellular pathways, reinforce themselves like a paranoid reinforcement of itself, and you start feeding into these pathways in your mind. So some of this therapy is working towards undoing that. Now, I'm not a behavioral scientist, and so I don't claim to know all the areas, and you have a deep interest in it, which is always interesting, because I find lay people now have far greater interest in certain subjects than the people who are claimed to be professionals in it, you know, which is great. And that's where we get great podcasts from, because people go down the rabbit holes that, you know, our behavioral scientists and our psychiatrists don't do. Psychiatry today, unfortunately, is mostly about medication.
Yeah, unfortunately. Well, that goes back to my point is, so one of the treatments for a borderline personality disorder was gabapentin combined with dialectical or cognitive behavioral therapy. Then there's a part of cognitive behavioral therapy which is just behavior. All they do is look at behavior, and they broke that out and they created what's called behavioral activation therapy. And it turns out just this one part of CBT is more effective than CBT. And it's just, and to me, I'm looking at this, the behavioral psychologist not looking at the looking at this through an evolutionary lens. If I look at this through an evolutionary lens, it was my ancestor who killed meat, who was happier. How does that not make sense? Well, there's 8 billion people on the planet. And so when you looked at it from first principles of evolutionary psychology, obviously behavioral activation therapy makes a ton of sense. And so,
but there's more than just going out and doing the kill. There's more than going out. There's more than going out in a hunting party. There's physical aspects of this that we are starting to understand even better. You know, full spectrum light. Right? For years we're talking like being in the sun's bad, UVA, UVB radiation. But the largest study that was just recently compiled, you know, like 17,000 patients followed over a long period of time, showed that sun exposure had no correlation to melanoma. Right? Sun damage with burns and things like that has a higher correlation with squamous cell carcinoma. But it's shown that people who had more sun exposure live longer. Of
course. And so, but how does this not make sense? We have 200,000 years of Homo sapien evolution where we lived out in the sun.
Our environmental evolution tells us to be outdoors.
Exactly. And then you find out that when you get the sunlight, it starts turning melatonin into serotonin. And you're just like, how does this not make sense?
Well, I have these patients that invest thousands and thousands of dollars on these red light therapy rooms, right? I just go fucking outside for an hour.
Exactly.
I'm like,
there's a nuclear reactor.
There's a huge furnace sending you all that wavelength for free.
93
for now, right now, the only thing that will always be free for now, I think, is going to be sunlight.
Yeah.
But someday they'll tax us for that
Yeah,
too.
for sure.
Right? So, but that's the thing. I mean, the further away we get from our human biology, the more deranged our behavior becomes.
Of course.
Right? And the crazy part is that social media, with this idea that it was going to bring us all together, it's actually divided us more.
Of course, yeah, of course.
And you know, studies show that we had more close friends before social media than we do today.
Yeah.
And there's another thing about this, right? You and I are sitting a few feet apart, right? There is a vibe in the room, right?
Yeah.
There is unspoken communication, whether we like to understand it or not, that occurs within proximity and between human beings who have close relationships. We've all had these experiences, right?
Well, it's also part because you and I went through puberty without a cell phone. I think that is a big part of it.
Well, what I'm getting at is that human proximity in a room matters more than at a distance.
Yes.
And there's something that happens. There's non-spoken communication that we're just getting to understand now, right? There's the telepathy tapes. Have you seen this on?
No.
Oh, this is really cool. So these are non-verbal autistic children who can use spelling boards where they can point out, but they can't speak. And there's a scientist up in Harvard, I forget her name, but she's shown that these children have almost telepathic powers with their parents and caregivers, right? And they also have this sort of telepathic ability to go into a space where a lot of kids with the same problem go to. They call it the hill. It's really fascinating stuff. So there's one like 7-year-old nonverbal kid on the spectrum, and she speaks fluent Danish through a sight board. And they said, well, how did you learn how to speak Danish? And the kid said, well, when I go to this place in my mind called the hill, there's a kid from Denmark there that like we talk, and they taught me Danish, right? And you say, well, this is fucking impossible, right? But then they do these experiments where they'll have the parent in one room looking at a storybook with pictures.
Yeah.
And they'll stop. They'll say, stop at this page 27. And there's a picture of a pirate or a pirate ship. And in another room, isolated from the parent, right, the child will start to draw out a pirate ship. And they'll ask them, what is mommy thinking right now? And they'll draw that out. A good example in nature, right, of proximity communication is when you look at a school of fish, right? You know, we have a bait ball, huge. You've all seen this on a Discovery Channel, Shark Week, right? When these fish school, right, they will shift direction all at the same time.
Yeah.
It's not a propagation of signal through the thing. Like propagation means
if you ever
like
watch sardines, it's unbelievable the way they.
How the fuck are they doing it, Michael? Right? This is evolutionary biology. You like evolutionary biology. This is part of our evolutionary biology that we have lost with verbal communication.
Correct, yeah.
And that we're decreasing even more through technological communication to the point that we don't have interaction, right? We have interaction at a distance, which is less effective for compassion. It's less effective for community, less effective for each other in communication. But sitting here, if we were doing this via Zoom, this shit wouldn't work.
Right.
Okay? You can get away with it. But the reality is...
It's a little off. You're right. I see what you're saying. Yeah, it definitely is.
And what I'm saying is that there is something being in proximity with other people that you can pick up on.
Got it.
We don't know what it is, right? It's almost vestigial. Like our organs, like the appendix, have shrunk down to the point we don't even know what it really was used for.
Yeah.
Our spleen is somewhat vestigial. There are parts of our cognitive behavioral brain that we had much more in tune long before we had verbal communication.
Correct, yeah.
And we're just now discovering the value of going back to that. And
yes.
That's if there's a rabbit hole in cognitive behavioral evolution that I love, it's that.
Yeah.
Because we're starting to understand that you can do things and you can re-pump up this organ again.
So one of the things that's interesting is, so Darwin, if you read on The Origin of Species, he goes over this concept of all psychology or all sort of complex adaptive systems coming back to natural selection, right? And then Freud had a similar hypothesis, but it was a little different. Basically, all of our proclivities come through sexual selection. And what happened was during that time period, so we're talking about the 1860s, is the idea, one of the concepts that Darwin came up with was with the idea of sexual selection in women deriving what men's proclivities were. And this was so anti-Victorian that people found it offensive.
Tell me more about this. Like, go down this. I think this is interesting.
Yeah. So basically the idea that of natural selection was offensive to a lot of people, especially Christians, because of the concept that we were related to primates. Then when you go down further down the hole, basically women are the way they are because men selected women to be that way, that was not offensive to people. It was the idea that men, the arena upon which men competed with each other for women was derived by the preferences of women. Well, the idea that men being designed by the preferences of women was offensive to men of that age. And that's why a lot of, if you look, Darwin, it wasn't one of these things where the origin of species was an instant hit classic.
No, Darwin actually had to sell it.
Correct.
He went around to scientific societies and he sold the idea.
But that's part of the reason why the scientific community didn't like Darwin's ideas was in part because of that one concept.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, in terms of mate selection, it's a co-evolutionary pressure, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean,
by the way, Dr. Buss, who came on my show, he talked about this. We're the only species where it's like this, where the arena upon which men compete is derived almost entirely by the proclivities of women, and vice versa. Women do what they do in part, in a major part, well, almost entirely.
Do you think there would be any wars if there was no genders? Like if we were all one gender? Like,
there'd be fewer wars.
If we didn't have sexual reproduction, where you had to have a mate, right?
Yeah.
Reproduced through parthenogenesis, which is basically a piece of you cleaves off and a new person comes out
cloning,
of it. Right. But that's a real technological frontier, Michael.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the potential not too far from now to take your own, skin cells and make your own offspring without a female mate. Right?
Yes.
And if we get to that point where there is no need for mating, do you think we're still going to have wars?
Yeah, Brave New World. That's kind of where we end up. Exactly.
Yeah.
No, that's Dr. Buss has another book called The Murderer Next Door, where he goes over that whole concept, where it was just like jealousy being an evolutionary adaptation. We think of jealousy as just sort of immaturity, especially in men. Whereas, or behavioral psychologists will look at it as almost like
men aren't the only ones that are jealous.
Well, exactly. But the maladaptive process of jealousy being some sort of this thing that we need to transcend past. Whereas evolutionary psychologists will look at jealousy and being like, this is how you knew that child was yours.
Jealousy comes from scarcity.
Sure.
And that's scarcity of any resource.
Well, today, but I'm talking about our ancestors, the ones that were never jealous were raising someone else's child. Like there was an evolutionary necessity for jealousy.
Well, that's a tribal sort of evolution. There's tribalism where the tribe shares everything almost as one organismal unit.
Sure.
Right? But there's going to be jealousy. Like if I'm going out on a hunt, we're all like guys going out on a hunt, and I got this really good spear.
Yeah.
And this thing could fly straight, like pierce the hide of some big ass buffalo. And I take home that kill every time. You got this rinky dink, sharpened friggin' bamboo stick, right? Yeah. And it ain't getting through. You're going to be jealous of that friggin' weapon that I have, right? And that's not necessarily a mate production thing, but down the line it is. But you just want to kill that fucking buffalo.
Yeah.
And you want that glory for yourself. Right, so jealousy is I believe, yes, it comes from in mate selection. There's a jealousy of scarcity of mate selection, but that jealousy is something way, way bigger. It's the jealousy comes from when you are in your mind cognitively projecting your self-image, you think you should be, you think you should have that fucking spear, okay, and you don't have it, right? And why don't you have it? Because I have it. Right? And that's where we get into this cognitive realm of jealousy. It's scarcity. This goes back to AI now. Right? So we are looking at a post-scarcity society, right? Let's fast forward, let's say 50 years, right?
Yeah.
Robotics is perfected, right? So every one of us has a sort of physical kinetic workforce at our control.
Yeah.
Knowledge is universal. So you can't have any knowledge of any sort of idea that I can.
Yeah.
Right? I have the same access to the same knowledge bank that you do. And resources, right? Well, we all have access to the ground below us and above us. So what happens when we have no scarcity anymore, right? What is society going to do at that point?
I think massive levels of depression initially.
Sure.
Yeah.
Because we need to compete.
Correct.
Our DNA tells us to fucking get in the arena and fight.
That what you're saying is so anti-behavioral psychology. Behavioral psychology basically believes the only reason that we are competitive is because of basically some sort of masculine patriarchy that built this whole thing.
Well, I mean, look, there is something to testosterone that creates competition.
Yes.
I mean, if you want to call it patriarchy, like the thing I have a problem with is that we are very sensitive to female hormonal, cycles and needs. We are taught that.
Yeah.
Right? There are a lot of, times when we talk about, well, it's that time of month for her and, give her a little space or, she's got really bad cramps. It's, it's the hormonal stuff. And, we like, if you want to be a likable mate, you're going to give that person some space, right? If they have those issues. We also have this sort of sensitivity towards the pregnancy cycle. They're going through something beautiful. And for menopause, we look at our moms and we kind of say, well, she's losing some of her femininity due to hormone decline. We don't have any sympathy for men's testosterone.
Correct.
Right? It's almost antithetical for this, for society to kind of uphold the guy who's like beating his chest to go, what an asshole, right? But that's what the chemical tells us to do, right? The chemical is telling us to conquer on land, conquer in the bedroom, right? But somehow we're not allowed to have those feelings because it doesn't work with
it's maladaptive for today.
It's maladaptive for society.
Yeah.
You can't have an entire society of men, looking to conquer. Because what's going to happen?
Yeah, you end up with Genghis Khan. Like
Rebellion,
exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's why he was so successful.
Yeah.
He basically took men and said, hey, let's go rape and pillage.
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you that's a glorified thing to do. And I'm going to tell you that all this murder, all this rape, you know what? That's what I want you to do. That's what God wants you to do. Well, hell yeah.
Again, in the Old Testament.
You're going to get people revving up the testosterone.
Yeah.
But that's not a good outcome.
Of course. Well, that's my point. Is like the concept in the Old Testament of the Israelites being told by God to kill the Canaanites, the Jezebites, and the Amalekites. I'm like, no, I think they just wanted to do that on their own. Like, I don't think God had anything to do with it.
I'm not making any religious comments today.
Yes, but I'm just like, I'm pretty sure, like, because it's like, take the virgin women for yourself. I'm like, I don't know, man. I think that might be your own preference.
But history is written by the victors,
yeah,
right?
Sure, of course.
So this is another fear of mine with AI. We don't have a lot of books left, right?
Yeah.
You go down to the local, public library here, it's mostly digital.
Yeah.
Which is fucking scary, because when you have the ability to rewrite all the books,
that's a good point.
In a stroke of a key, right, and rewrite the entire library of the world in one keystroke, we will have the ability to control the narrative of history to whoever is in control of that technology.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where, despotism comes from. That's where tyranny comes from.
Of course.
Our authors talked about this, the Brave New World you mentioned before, Aldous Huxley. Those who don't know, it's a great book. It's like 94 pages. And
it's so good.
Yeah. And in that society, all babies are born in these little, artificial wombs. And they, at the outset, decide whether you're going to be an alpha, which is like the scientists or the political class, a beta, the working class, delta, and then the gammas, right?
Yeah.
And it's a stratification, it's social hierarchy that's decided by a governing body. And what do they do in this book to keep people from being miserable? They have a drug called
Soma. Yeah.
Right? Which ironically, Wallace Pharmaceuticals made a drug named Soma. It's just like, come on,
of course,
too fucking close to home, right?
Yeah.
Could you find something else?
Yeah,
that was a sedative. It was a muscle relaxing sedative that was very popular in the 50s and 60s. But there's not anything different than what's happening today, right? We see all this stuff. Not to get heavy on this, but like, we have cannabis legalization, and we have a rampant sort of drug culture in this country that glorifies partying. Right, in a way that's compensation for a lack of the upward social structure mobility.
Yeah,
right?
There needs to be some level of struggle. I mean, that's the point. And that's why it's like, and I say this, and this is what a lot of people find offensive. I do think that what gets a woman over depression is different than what gets a man over depression.
What gets a woman over depression?
Talking about her feelings often, or at least more so than a man. Like for me, solving the problem.
Freud said it was a good orgasm.
Yeah, okay. Well, but still, in that case, she's dealing with an emotion, right?
Oh, she's getting way out of that emotion.
Yeah, exactly.
Too, right?
Exactly.
The word hysteria, where it comes
from,
right?
Yeah.
What it,
histo was female, and then teria, I can't remember.
Freud said hysteria is the wandering uterus.
Okay.
Right? Some bullshit. Some Victorian bullshit.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
But the reality is that he felt that in achieving orgasm, a lot of hysteria could be controlled.
Sure.
Right. And I'm not going to stand here and say that.
I'm not going to say that isn't true.
I'm not going to say it's not exactly. Yeah. I'm not going to say that's not true, but I will say that the Japanese have a really interesting word for the post-orgasmic clarity that a mind has, and there's no doubt. Nobody argues against that, right? Yeah. Whether it's male or female, you have an orgasm, you climax. There's a moment of fucking calm. You're like, hey, the bombs drop. I don't give a shit. We're good. We're good for about the next 45 minutes.
Yeah.
No calls, nothing.
Yeah.
The rent's due. I don't give a shit. But there's a reality to that, and that we cleanse the mind with those sorts of moments.
Sure.
Yeah. Freud was really kind of off kilter, though. He tied too much to your first interaction with your mom, and he had this idea of like Oedipus, the Oedipus complex. You want to kill your dad and sleep with your mom. That's bullshit. Okay. I mean, maybe for some people, yeah, it could happen. But I think his student Jung was much more on point.
Sure.
Carl Jung talked about a collective unconscious that we all share. We are all the same thing. Right? This is a simulation in Jung's mind. Yeah. Right? And there's a simulation theory in science right now. But Carl Jung felt that we had a collective like unconscious that is all of us share one brain when we think about it. Yeah. And this conscious state of existence is just us putting the headset on coming into this life.
Yeah. It is interesting. If you ever read Martha Stout, Dr. Martha Stout writes a book on sociopathy. And one of the things she talks about is a collective sociopathy, meaning you take a bunch of people who are rational thinkers, who absolutely are empathetic, walk their dogs, take care of their children, and pay taxes, but you put them all together on a board, and then they start acting as a collective sociopath, only interested in profit.
Yeah, there's studies that were done where like you take these, I don't know who ran studies, but it's a very famous study, right, where they took in these two subjects, right? And they said, okay, we're going to put this guy here. He's going to answer some questions. And every time he gets it wrong, you're going to electrocute him. Yeah. Right? But every time you electrocute him, we're going to give you $1 or something like that. And after a while, people just did not care about the screams and the person was in another room, but you could hear them screaming, right? And it shows you that when you have a white coat in a scientific setting and you're saying, hey, go ahead and do this, it's fine, you'll do anything, well, even cause suffering.
How about the My Lai massacre and during Vietnam, where you had rational, like enlisted men who were murdering civilians because that's what their NCO told them to do. It wasn't a platoon full of sociopaths. No. It was actually,
but that's war, Mike.
They had just gotten what I'm saying is a selective sociopathy or collective sociopathy.
Well, let me ask you. I mean, you were in the services. You're in Air Force, right? Yeah. There is a certain point in basic training, which is the breaking of the ego.
Yes.
Right? It is the ego death that you must go through to be a soldier.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And so that's been proven throughout millennia. I mean, the first generals understood that they needed obedience to win a war, right? So do you fault the soldier for what they're doing? Do you fault the general? Do you fault the system? Do you fault the society?
Yeah.
Right? Where does fault lie on that spectrum for when, atrocious things happen? That's a hard question.
Well, in that case, I would fault the NCOs and the officers. But in general, what you're saying, I don't fault the mechanism of psychology, of that type of psychology. It probably had some necessity to solve adaptive problems in our past. But the thing is,
in military boot camps,
what I'm saying is there was, I believe it was the Roman legion had sacked this one city of Gaul, or they had sieged this one city in Gaul, and the men of Gaul puts their children and their wives out so that the Romans then had to take care of those children, thereby allowing them to have more food, and then having the women and children now be the problems of the Roman legion. And the Roman legion just killed the women and children because they were like we had to, because what we understood what they were trying to do to us. And so and I'm not saying like it's okay. You don't want to be violent, but if all of your neighbors are violent, then the adaptive solution is for you to also additionally be violent.
If you're a soldier in that platoon and you disobey orders, what happens to you?
Of course, you die. Yeah, it's another survival mechanism.
It's either keep going and survive or be killed by my friends.
How many people probably followed Genghis Khan in the 13th century, and then
said, once in a while, I don't feel good about this, right?
But it's like the alternative is death, or being a member of the Communist Party under Mao, or what happened.
I mean, look at North Korea. I mean, these are 3 generations of people that have been under a mind control program that know nothing else, right? And it's not that they're afraid to do it; they just can't.
Yeah.
Right. And so do you fault the people? Do you fault the society? Again. Human beings, unfortunately, we are inherently susceptible to influence, and it happens in so many subversive ways that we don't even see it. Yeah. And we get this today through social media influence. Going back to, who do people use for their therapy now? If you're using a chatbot that's job is to keep you talking to it, of course it's going to be really good at talking to you.
Yeah.
Right? It's not going to be like, hey, shut the fuck up, all right? Go get a job. You want to hear a funny story, right? There was a point in my internship, right? And I was being abused. I mean, literally up like 72 hours. The chief resident was a dick, like an absolute, kind of ugly guy. He looked like he just kind of had this big, long, like under neck, like big
Yeah.
bullfrog neck, bulgy eyes, fat, kind of waddling through the thing. And here I am, this like guy. I was going around the floors, and like the nurses were. I was always cool with the nurses. I always took an interest in them. And,
Yeah.
you know, you get more shit done, right? I would bring some of the nurses, like, you know, on night shift, like donuts and coffee, and I'd get the work done that nobody else could get done because we're in this together, right?
Yeah.
This guy fucking hated me, right? And I mean, there were times when he would throw me up against the wall and like have his hand around my throat, and I'd just be sitting there like, if I swing at this guy, I'm out of my training program.
Yeah.
And I can never work as a physician. So you take the abuse, right? And I remember one morning, this is a credit to my mom, right? I'm laying in bed after probably being up 36 hours, and I'm staring at the ceiling, and I'm like, why am I doing this to myself? This is undignified, right? This is against everything I was raised to believe. So call my mom, right? I said, Mom, I can't do this anymore. I don't want to do this. I've been up for 36 hours, you know, I'm being told that I'm stupid in front of like people just to demean me. This guy threw me up against the wall. He had his hand around my throat. I said, I think I'm going to quit. And there was like a 2-second pause. And she goes, all right, well then quit and forever be a quitter. Click, hung up the phone.
Yeah.
And I'm just laying in bed. I'm like, oh, fuck, I can't quit now. Like, you know, but ChatGPT ain't going to say that.
Yeah.
To you,
Yeah,
okay?
they're not going to tell you.
Yeah, a loved one will tell you when you're being dramatic, right? And, you know, again, it goes back to friends. Like, you have guy friends, you go out with them, they're like, dude, calm down. Like, stop being crazy. Stop, just let it go, right?
Yeah.
We need friends more now than ever before.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, going back to what I said before, all men have a burden to perform. Unless you're born in with a trust fund or incredibly good looking, men have a burden of performance. And if your therapist doesn't tell you, hey, look, I can't remember who I heard saying this, but it was like any therapist who doesn't immediately look at your diet and exercise on off the rip, or whether or not you're accomplishing actual physical goals, that therapist is performing malpractice. And when you think about what made Homo sapiens the apex predator on the planet, it wasn't one guy with a spear. It was a collective group of men working together.
Yeah,
with spears.
they're going out.
Yes.
They're in good shape. And if you weren't part of that, you were out.
Yeah.
Right. If you look at the Stoic philosophers, and I really like this because, but these guys weren't just philosophers; they were in the gym.
Yeah,
okay?
Of course.
Being in the gym was such an important part of philosophy, even back in the ancient Greek times. You know, wrestling, you know, climbing, working out, running. They did not see a difference between mental health and physical health. They were one and the same. So you're 100% right. If you go into your therapist's office and you are not well taken care of and you're not loving yourself, right, then how can you ever be loved by anybody else?
Yeah.
Right? And, you know, Seneca on his deathbed, he was put to death, you know, he was ordered to be put to death twice, right?
Yeah.
Once by Claudius, right? And then by Nero, right? Claudius gave him a reprieve. They brought him back for round 2. Nero, he was his tutor. Nero thought he was conspiring, made him go slit his own wrists, you know. Before he died, among his friends, they said, well, what did you learn in life? And Seneca said, I learned to be a friend to myself, right? And I think that's one of the things that if you're out of shape and you're not taking care of yourself, are you being a friend to that body of yours?
Yeah.
Right? So this takes me to, you know, this whole black pill movement, right?
Yeah.
You know, and there's all these ideologies, red pill, black pill.
Shout out to all the black pill guys who follow me
Yeah, that's cool.
and make videos about me every week. Yeah.
What do they say?
They can't. So my whole thing is, I believe there's a great study by Lucy Hill. She's I believe she's a psychologist, evolutionary psychologist. I could be wrong about that. But she does this study where she looks at 176 couples and she looks at when they met and versus when they started being in a relationship.
Yeah.
And they looked at how far that was, and then they correlated the physical attractiveness of the two people in the couple. This is a 2015 study.
Okay.
And
so when they meet and when they start hooking up.
Yeah, so they look at how many months were in between, and then they look at the correlation between the physical attractiveness. And what they find is people who met, if the best way to date a girl who was a 10 that you just met was to also be a 10. But as they got to 4 or 5 months, the correlation dropped and got cut in half. And once they got to 9 months, the correlation was not statistically different from 0.
Well, because you become a friend, right?
Correct. So, but here's the thing. If that's true, then black pill isn't real. Does that make sense? Because what it means is there are other ways for you to generate attraction as a man. Black pill specifically means only looks matter to women.
Well, you know, look, there in my estimation, there are 3 categories of relationship, or three eras of relationship.
Yeah.
Okay. And this it was taught to me by one of our common friends, Jamie Lynn.
Yes.
Miller, right.
Yeah.
Shout out to Jamie. But like Jamie, taught me this, and I thought it was really appropriate. And the more I look at it, the more it applies. There's 3 phases. Okay. First is attraction. Right. Do you look like somebody that does something?
Yes.
Like, it gets the butterflies going. Right. Second is connection. Right. Do we have something in common? Can we talk? Can we kick it? Can we go?
Yeah.
Can we go on a hike and spend 5 hours driving in a car and not want to fucking jump out the window?
Yeah.
Okay. And the third thing is alignment. Right. When you're young, alignment means, hey, you want to move to Detroit? Oh, I'll move there with you. I got nothing going on. But as you get older, those things get harder. Attraction still is that instantaneous kind of getting over the hill.
Yes.
Doesn't mean it can't be overcome with certain other things like success, good game, and things like
Exactly.
But I will say that if you are in the, as the black pill guys say, the 1, 2, and 3 category of unattractive, your chances of having a mate go down significantly.
They do.
But this is the problem with black pill. It's a nihilistic mentality. Okay, it's bullshit. You don't have to live as a 1 forever. Okay, and
Yeah.
this is the whole nexus of my career. Like, I have had guys come in. Right, if you're balding, I could put your hair back on the top of your head. You got bad teeth, I have a good oral surgeon that's going to give you the best looking smile. If you have a bad jaw, they can also rearrange your jaw and move it forward, right? If you're out of shape, well, I put you on some Ozempic, but get to the gym,
Yeah.
right? If you don't have enough muscle mass, maybe you need testosterone.
Yeah.
And if after you do all this stuff, you need some more definition. There's some trouble areas that your genetics, which is a factor,
Yeah.
leaves you with big love handles or inability to get a 6-pack. I can lipo that and fix that.
I hear that argument all the time, and I agree with you. You remember Tyson Fury,
Yeah.
the world champion? You see how his body looked in comparison to Deontay Wilder?
No. What is it?
So Tyson Fury.
I know he's like a big,
He's 6'9", British
I know
guy,
exactly who he looks
but he
like.
looked like a bag of milk. His body, he's
got the dad bod.
But my point is, this guy was in the gym all the time, and his genetics
yeah.
still made him look like that. Whereas Deontay Wilder, at 38 years old, had a testosterone level over 1,000.
Yeah, it's genetics.
It was natural. It was genetic.
But you know what? I could take a Tyson Fury.
Yeah.
I could fix those love handles.
Yes.
I can give him the 6-pack, right? It's not a problem for Tyson Fury. The guy's a prize fighter, right?
Yeah.
He's knocking people out for millions of dollars, right? But for the average guy who's doing the work, who is still struggling with getting past that last bit of self-confidence,
Yeah.
you got gynecomastia, I can fix that. It can be fixed. You are not pigeonholed into this genetic black box.
Yeah.
And it's not nihilistic, right? So, I mean, look, can you kick a good game? Sure. But if you show up with your hair uncombed, bad breath, bad teeth, bad clothes, bad posture, bad body habitus, I don't care if you're Casanova, you're not getting through the door.
Sure.
Okay.
So you're talking about looks maxing and then also surgery.
So look,
Yeah.
there's no ideology of this shit.
Right.
I mean, when you get into an ideology, you get like zealous in something, you get into overgeneralization because there's nuance to everything.
Yeah.
You just gave me an example. Tyson Fury in the gym all the time, can't get the love handles go away.
Yeah.
Right? He still knocks motherfuckers out,
Yeah.
right? But the reality is that it's not all one thing. Appearance does matter. Okay? Anybody
Yeah.
who says it doesn't is full of shit.
Yeah.
Okay? And a guy who's got a 1 in appearance, maybe he's got a 10 in sort of game, but the chances of him standing in a room and a woman coming to him are 0.
Yeah.
Right? But once he gets there, he can hook them with his talk and his work. And that's not a problem. That's the second part. That's the connection, right? So attraction has to be there at some level.
Yes.
Now, the hardest thing for men, I think, is being of short stature, right? But today, there are surgeries that you can do. Now, I'm not an advocate for this stuff, but if it really is your obstacle and you feel it's your obstacle, there's ways to change it.
Yeah. So it's they fracture the
Or,
femur.
Yeah, but you know what, Michael? You don't even need to do that.
Yeah.
Go online, buy some shoes with lifts in it, and you can gain 4 to 5 inches,
I have
right?
several friends that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and almost all of them wear shoes with
Women
lifts.
wear high heels.
Yes.
All right, let's go to something.
Yeah.
This is a fucking not a secret, okay?
Yeah.
Men need to get with the program,
Yeah.
okay? Women have been adorning and deceiving us with appearance since the dawn of time.
Yes.
Okay? It's part of it. We go back and we look at burial grounds of women. We see them adorned with jewelry, right?
Yeah.
We see them with things in their hair. If we go from the top to the bottom of a woman, right? And we think about the ways in which women adorn or enhance their appearance, let's just start with the hair.
Yeah.
Hair color, hair texture, hair volume, right? Put hair extensions in, right? You start to comb it differently. You have different shapes that frame your face. Let's move down a little bit. Forehead, we have Botox there. You have makeup. You have bad complexion, you can put foundation on it. Let's go down to the eyes. We got eyelash extensions, you got mascara, you have contact lenses that change the color of your eyes. You could put eyeshadow over your eyes. Get to the cheeks, you have rouge. You make it look like she's blushing all the time. You can contour the look of a face with makeup. You could do also, I'm not saying for men to wear makeup. Right? Bras. Push those breasts up to make it look like a butt cheek, right? Evolutionarily triggers this idea of mating, right? High heels. It sticks an ass out in the air. It lengthens the legs. It makes them look more muscular. It gives them a height advantage. They've been doing this for centuries, and we're just getting along with not improving our appearance with the idea that brains and brawn and amassing wealth and good game are the only things that will matter. No, we have options today. Okay. You want blue eyes, Michael? You could either wear contact lenses or there's a surgeon that's going to change the color of your eyes. I don't advocate for it. It's dangerous.
It's something in Europe where they use some sort of light. Yeah, they put a dye in there, but there's also something where they use some kind of light. Or I can't remember.
Can laser. So everybody's really blue-eyed underneath the brown pigment. You just need to laser the brown out, but you got to hope.
Yeah, that's how it was explained to me.
It's just a pigment overlay, right? So most babies when they're born, they have a bluish tint to their eyes. And then as the pigment matures, it becomes a color. But you can laser that pigment out. It's dangerous. I don't advocate for it. But here's the thing. Right, there are things that women appear that women perceive as attractive, right? And stature and height is one of those things, right? Why? Because it's a protection status, right? It's also a gene that you want to pass on, because you want your children to have an advantage. And there's, what is it, like 58% of CEOs are over 6 foot. That's only people over 6 feet only account for 15% of the population. So
Correct.
How is that disparity? That 15% of the population makes up 58% of the CEOs.
Well, it goes back to the preferences of women. It goes
well,
back to,
I mean, also, let's talk about the playground, right? If you're a small guy on the playground growing up, you're going to get bullied. And that affects the way you act as a person. It affects your self-esteem.
Sure.
Right? It puts you on a downward pressure spiral throughout your upbringing, which when they get to you with your Men of Action program, what you're really undoing is years of downward pressure.
That's exactly right.
Years of the collective thumb on your back, right? Pushing you down. Right? And you've got to say, well, let's unbreak those psychological habits. Let's unbreak those pathways in your mind and say, no, you're not good enough, which I commend you for, which I think is really important. It is not the only thing, but it is a key to success.
It is the collective know that you are deadlifting every day as a man. That's the way we describe it.
Say that again.
The collective know that you are deadlifting every day as a man.
That's the burden you carry.
The know that you don't have enough money, the know that you aren't tall enough, the know that you aren't as good enough of an athlete.
Well, that's
the
thing
that
I
women
tell my son. I go, you need to understand, for men, life is about rejection.
Yes.
And it's not because you're not good enough. It's just because that's what I believe that men have to deal with much more than women do. Ours is we have to be selected, right? We have to be chosen, right? For women, it's a permission, right? There's a difference when men have a lot of mating partners, right? Guy who's slept with, I don't know, hundreds or maybe thousands of women.
Yes.
What do they think of him? He's like a conqueror, right? Maybe some say, oh, it's sleazy. But if you have a lot of mates as a man, you're not typically considered a slut.
Yes. Not typically, not historically. So.
Not historically. But if you're a woman, right, and you've had hundreds of partners, the connotation is that it's not a good thing, right? And why is that? For a woman, having sex is an act of permission. You have to permit the person to have sex with you, right? For man, it's an act of aggression or ambition, right? So a man who has many mates has a lot of ambition, right? A woman who has many mates has
just a low standard, low barrier.
Has allowed that selection criteria to be low. And that's why we have this disparity, why women say, well, it's not fair. Well, it isn't, I get it, but you have the ability to say no, right? And that's really where society leaves it. So, I mean, I think for a man, it's not the Babe Ruth thing. You can't take 100 swings and expect to be still playing that game if you don't hit one. Right? And that also works against guys. Like if, you're in the proximity of I worked in a hospital, so there's floors of nurses, right? If you strike out with 2 of those nurses, you're never going to get anywhere with the rest of them.
Yes.
Okay? So it can work against you.
Social circle,
Social circle. Social proof, right? And pre-selection. So there's the opposite of pre-selection, right? Which is you
get friend zoned by too many girls in the group, and then all of them see you.
There's something wrong, and they're not going to bother to think about why. They're not going to go, oh, let me figure out why everybody else rejected this guy. It's like, forget it.
Yeah.
Move on to the next one. It's a tough world. And you know, having a son, I have daughters too.
Yeah.
You know, you kind of, he's getting prepared by his sisters very well because they pick on him a lot, right? And it makes you stronger as a boy.
Yeah.
I got to stop and step in every once in a while where they're like yelling at him for something crazy, like chewing to him, right? But, you know, in a social sense, if you're 25 years old, sitting at a table, hunched over your plate and like shoveling food in your mouth, you're not going to get a second date.
Yeah, correct.
You know? Maybe if you have a Lambo, she'll take another ride. But like there's certain things, and this is the thing. It's not just one thing. But I do believe that if you do love yourself, right, you start to see all this matters.
Yeah.
Right. How I dress. Okay. You don't have to. One of my best friends does great. He's like an alpha, right? Yeah. He has 4 black T-shirts, 4 black jeans, 4 pairs of sneakers. That's it. None of them are designer. But you know what he does every day that I noticed? He irons them every day when he wears them.
Yeah.
He washes them on a regular basis. And the jeans, the more frayed, he's got a set of them from brand new indigo, like $900 Japanese jeans to Levi's that he's had for years. But you know what? He takes care of them every day, right? He doesn't go out with them smelling like shit.
Yeah.
Okay. He has them ironed, right? He has them crispy. And you don't need a lot of money. Like you wear black T-shirts every day, right? Yeah. The great philosophers all wear black, right? You know, or white vestments, but you don't need a lot. So if you're going to be short of money and you don't have a wardrobe expense, right, just be clean about it, right? And if you don't have a washer dryer, get a fucking bottle of Woolite in your kitchen sink and then air dry them, right? There's no excuse for that lack of discipline, right? The rest you can work on.
I think to what you're saying before, why not just do all of it? Learn to run all the plays. Don't just run the ball, also pass the ball. So what I mean by that is don't just rely. Some of the guys that I've seen that give the worst dating advice I've ever heard are extremely good-looking men. They give terrible dating advice.
They don't have to give advice.
It's exactly my point. It's like Shaquille O'Neal teaching me to be taller. And then when I see the guys, some guys, they only lead with money. Some guys only think, well, I know a buddy of mine, he's really funny, and he's slept with a lot of women because he's really funny, and he's very overweight. And he's like, he doesn't see a necessity to lose the weight.
The magic trick of humor.
Exactly.
So magicians and funny people can get away with that trick for a short period of time.
Yeah,
right?
correct.
But it's often not, you can do it over and over again, but you don't just necessarily keep the woman.
Yeah.
And
run all the plays. And one of the plays is get in shape. One of the plays might be get the hair transplant. One of the plays might be get a rhinoplasty.
Get on testosterone.
Correct.
If your testosterone is low. Because I have a friend, he's deathly afraid of needles, and he's in his 40s, and like he's got this. He's been in the last few years getting worse and worse, kind of like moping. I'm like, dude, you need to check your testosterone level. He finally checked his level is like 48.
Yeah,
I'm like, that's not compatible.
That's not compatible with a 94-year-old.
Exactly. Yeah. I go, you need to be on testosterone replacement therapy. You need to do it safely, not at the back of the gym.
Yeah.
You need to have look for anybody out there is doing this. When you take testosterone, your hemoglobin goes up, and the excess testosterone could be aromatized into estrogen.
Yeah.
And you get this. What do you get when you get estrogen? You get boobs.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're taking testosterone, you're not checking your levels on a quarterly basis, you won't know if your estradiol and your estrogen's rising, right? And then suddenly you wake up and you go, oh my God, I got muscles, but I got breasts.
Yeah.
Not helpful in the whole grand scheme of things. So if you're going to do testosterone replacement, go to a licensed professional that's actually going to monitor your blood levels. If you need an anastrozole, which is an estrogen
Aromadex or anastrozole,
then they'll put it in. I mean, the easiest thing to do is if you go to a doctor, the easiest thing to do is have them compound the testosterone and the anastrozole together.
Yes.
Right? So that you don't even have to think about it. So once you inject, you get your testosterone, you get your anastrozole, you don't have a risk of estrogenization, and you can restore that drive within you.
And that aromatization is the less body fat you have. The more body fat, the more aromatization that you can have. And so
it happens in the periphery.
Correct. So if you continue to be on the testosterone and you diet along with it, you can get to a point where you need less anastrozole.
Yeah. I came here today just, part of it's like it's an interesting cross section, right? As a plastic surgeon, I'm a purveyor of the picks and shovels of success.
Yeah.
Right. We deal sometimes with. I say it today. We sell self-esteem, and I'm not going to be ashamed of saying that because that's in some way that's what we do. Right. We take people who don't feel good about themselves, and we give them an opportunity to feel good about themselves.
Yeah.
Right. Ozempic and these GLP-1 and 2 blockers are essentially esteem drugs. right? Yes,
Yeah.
the reason why people who are unhealthy, overweight, obese, or diabetic take it is for health reasons. But the reason why people who take it who are of normal weight are to try to get into a lower body fat index, lower body mass index, lower body fat percentage, because that gives you a greater chance of clothing options, gives you a more fit looking body. And what does that do? It makes your self-esteem go through the roof.
Yeah.
We've seen a decline in plastic surgery over the last 2 years for a number of factors, but mostly the liposuction business has taken a massive decline.
Because of Ozempic.
Yeah. But there's another thing. When you take a person who's maybe 25 pounds overweight and they lose 30 pounds, especially for females, their self-esteem goes through the roof. And the first thing they do is they go to the industry that has the greatest mind lock on women, the beauty and fashion industry.
Yeah.
Right? And they go buy the clothes that they didn't feel like they could fit into before. And they're spending most of their take-home income on buying a wardrobe.
Do you know that 85% of consumer income is female?
Yes.
85. Now, consumer debt, men have as much consumer debt as women.
Yeah.
But 80.
Somebody's paying for that.
That number, I was like, why do I get ratioed on TikTok? And sometimes, I'll have a video go viral, and then I'll have a bunch of people come up to me, and I was like, "Oh, it's because you can't sell women's products on a podcast talking about evolutionary psychology."
They're dealing in self-esteem. Women have an incredibly competitive landscape to operate in.
Yeah.
Right. Because they're competing for resources. Right.
Yeah.
If you look at an evolutionary standpoint, the better looking they are, the better the mate they can get, the better the security they can have for their offspring, the better trip they're going to take. Right.
Yes.
So a lot of that goes down to that evolutionary psychology.
And it seems bad, especially to the black pillars, until if I was thinking...
He's talking about these black pillars like they're like...
Oh, they come after me. The flat earthers and the black pillars.
Why do they come after you?
Because I teach men to be friends with women, and if you're friends with women, and those women approve of you, you will meet other women and date women way out of your league.
You could also get a dog and walk down the beach, and as long as the woman sees that you can take care of a small animal that's helpless, that it totally depends on you,
correct,
you can get the same effect.
Yeah, cats. I have the same exact thing.
I don't know about cats, though.
No, cats are the best, man. I'm telling you.
I get that. Look, dude, be wary of a man who keeps cats, right? Yeah. No, but I don't. Cats are a unique creature, right? They tend to look down on human beings, whereas dogs look up.
But my point is, if you get used to being around a cat, women are easy. Because you give them attention, they run away, and you ignore them, they come sit on your lap.
Fair enough.
You just sort of
it's their prerogative.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
It's their prerogative. Like a cat has prerogative. And so do a lot of females. They have the prerogative of whether or not to spend time with you.
Yeah.
And why does a cat come to you? Like, what do you do that gets your cats to come to you?
When I ignore them, or when I just sit there and I'm looking at the TV, they come and sit right between me and the television.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Isn't that funny? Because one of the things that happens in relationships is the less you care, the more the other person really wants to express you.
You're describing a concept in psychology or game, and then again with black pill, there is no game with black because of the ones, there's some mode 1 guys. I could explain to you what all these things.
No, I love it. I mean, I just dipped my toe in this, and I'm like, some of it's accurate.
Yeah.
I mean, some of it's got real basis in fact, and numbers bear out. But I hate the nihilism of it.
So that's it. That's what black pill is. So red pill is the concepts of evolutionary psychology manifesting in intersexual dynamics, but there's a smidgen of misogyny in there, so a lot of people don't like.
Yeah, I think that whole movement of red pill got kind of derailed.
Correct.
By that. Yeah.
Correct. Black pill is the concept that women only care about procuring superior genetics from alpha Chad-looking men, and everything else is a waste of time. Blue pill is the concept that everything that red pill says is wrong, and it's only a function of patriarchy and behavioral psychology.
Yeah, they're all ideology.
Correct. And then mode 1 is the concept that the only thing you should do is go up to women immediately, tell them you want to have sex with them, and if they don't immediately say yes, move on to the next woman. That's the concept of mode 1. Then
is that a philosophy?
Yeah, so Alan Roger Curry wrote a book called Mode 1, where it's like no free attention to women.
Can we run that experiment in town?
Yeah, exactly.
Can we do like a David Attenborough and mic up?
They did
guys?
this.
Yeah.
Don't you remember there were studies they did in the 70s and 80s? They can't do them anymore. Yeah. Where they would have a really good-looking male model and female model walk up to men and women on a college campus and say, "Would you? Can I get your number? Will you go on a date with me? Would you come home and have sex with me?"
And these are 10s.
Yeah, these are really, really good-looking men and women.
Right. And of course, how did that turn out?
With the men, can I get your number? It was like 70 percentile. Will you go on a date with me? High 70s. Will you have sex with me? 0. No women said yes. There were some cases in France, I think.
Where you got to be worried about your safety as a woman.
Correct.
Right. This could be Ted Bundy, right? He's a good-looking guy, right?
Yeah, Ted, exactly. And then the opposite For men, it was like, will you go on a date with me? It was like, will you get my number? Will you go on a date with me? Will you have sex with me? It was actually higher than will you go on a date with me? There's something like 70.
What do you mean? Like the female was asking?
Female would go up to college students, and again, you can't run this data now. You can't have guys walking
with a university approval, Michael.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
you can do anything you want
Yeah.
as a blogger and a social media.
Well, the reason they haven't run this study in like 20 years, and what happens is the female goes up to men and says, "Would you have sex with me?" And it was like 76% of men said yes.
What did the other percentage say?
They were lying because their girl was nearby, or they didn't want to be judged, or they were probably
there's a bias in that.
Exactly.
But it's interesting. Yeah, I think it doesn't matter how attractive. Well, I won't say that, but I think for a woman, if she wants to have sex at any time, whether she is old, young,
there is no force. There's no thing in the world that requires less force than a woman getting sex. Yeah,
that's an interesting statement. But I think there's some truth to it. I mean, because it's an act of permission, and there are many, many men looking for that permission. Yeah, right. For men, it's complete opposite. But I hate the fact that when I look at this black pill stuff, and I've only gotten my toe in it, right? And I hate the fact that there's this idea you can't fix that.
So I asked Wheat Waffles, who's like the alpha black pillar, to debate me, and he called me a bully, and he won't debate me.
Well, is it actually person? Because I came through those things as I was kind of like preparing for this podcast, and I didn't see any face to it. It's a faceless. It's a faceless social media.
So Wheat Waffles, I believe he does show his face sometimes. He's a Irish guy, I believe. Okay, or he's British. There's also the black pill then leads to passport bros. Do you know what this is?
Oh yeah, well that's passport bros. I mean, here's the thing. Part of the whole, evolutionary psychiatry, psychology, is that your means matter. Right? What you can provide in terms of security, financial security matters. Right? In a society where your means have diminished value, right, you're not going to be seen as a desirable sort of mate. Right? So in this country, I think it's like right now, if you make under 60,000, you're below. You're not middle class anymore. You're in the
So the median man, I believe, is 59,000.
59,000, right?
Yeah.
If you take a salary of 60,000 a year and you go down to some countries in South America, you go to sub-Saharan Africa, you're living like a king. Yeah. Right. And so what that means is that you can take that that financial well-being and translate it into a greater outcome in those countries. You can have a 3-bedroom apartment in a good part of town for $800, right? Which creates a nest, right? That a woman's going to see and say, hey, this is a good place to kind of, hang out, and this may be a good place to raise my children. You can buy yourself a maid every day for $10 a day. Yeah. You can have a personal chef for $20 a day. So when she comes over, you have somebody lay out a 3-course dinner for you that you haven't even picked a finger up for. Yeah. Right. So what happens there? You, as a provider, become much more attractive. Yeah. Right. So we never talk about the money in the red, blue, black pills, right? But that's a force multiplier.
Of course. Well, yeah. I mean, right? I think the trick is using money as a funnel and not a crutch. Using, like, for instance...
Yeah, but look, if you're renting a Lambo and trying to get laid with it, that's a one-trick pony. Right?
Yeah, correct. But the difference between let's go wakeboarding every weekend, so I have a wakeboarding boat and I invite a bunch of girls on there, that's using money as a funnel.
Very smart, Michael.
Yes.
Very, very smart.
Exactly. Versus using money as a crutch where it's like, I meet a girl online and I pay for first-class tickets for her to fly out here, and when she gets to her hotel room, I've already bought her a bag. That's using money as a crutch. Yeah. That's the difference between money as a crutch and money as a...
You're creating a net. That guy's got a fishing pole.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Exactly.
So in both of these, you're trying to catch something.
Yeah.
Hopefully not a disease, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But
exactly.
I mean, I think it's smart because if you look at Miami, right? Why is this place considered like the Riviera of the United States? Yeah. Miami, Fort Lauderdale, that greater Broward County area. I lived down there for 2 years. Yeah. I loved it. What you see is wealthy guys move down there. Either they have boats or they have access to boats. Yeah. And I don't care who you are, man, woman, whatever. Nothing like being on a boat for a day. Yeah. In the intracoastal of Miami. Yeah. With, good food, good friends, good sunshine. I don't care who you are. It's an amazing experience. It's nice. You go stop the boat at a sandbar, you dive into these nice blue waters, you can see the bottom. I mean, all human beings love that stuff.
Yeah, of course.
But if you're a guy and you're trying to get more girls in your sphere of influence, having an object like that creates a funnel, and there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. But it gives you an advantage over the guys who are standing on the dock, not able to do that. Yeah. Now, where does that fall in the pill ideologies? I mean,
No, it's a So for instance, what a black pill person would say is that she's having sex with you, but she doesn't have any attraction towards you. She's only doing it. And so what the red pill guy might say is, well, no, one of the things a woman would want evolutionarily. So there's David Buss does a study looking at women's preferences as far as resources is concerned. And women want men who make about 1.6 as much as them.
So let's go back to those three big pillars.
Yeah.
Attraction, connection, alignment.
Yes.
The attraction is the first thing. I mean, yes, can you bypass it with connection and that's game? Sure. Right? You can, but chances are you have a statistically better chance of getting through those lines by being more attractive. There's nothing I disagree with that about. I in plastic surgery have found this to be transformative for some men.
Yes.
We can change exactly how they feel. I have, countless guys that come in and say, you put a full head of hair back on my head. I can't tell you how much more confident I am. Right? I get these young guys with boobs, like they have to wear double T-shirts, or people who have what we call hyperhidrosis, excessive sweating. I have a device that, we basically nuke the sweat glands in your armpit, and you never have that problem again. But if you're suffering from like bad pit stains and walking around not exploring options to fix this, you're going to be pushed down the social hierarchy status over and over again until you find out, hey, I can solve this problem. I can get past this. Then your work comes in.
Yeah, so
it's the rehabilitation of the male psyche that you're doing and giving men a way to find, connection, right? Connection is what keeps a woman, right? But then you get to the last layer, which is alignment. And I think that's where, the other part of being a man comes in is can you provide? Can you protect?
Sure.
Can you give them a long-term relationship?
And does your female partner support the way you provide and protect? That's another issue where I've seen before. It's like because again, some of the work I do is controversial. The girl I'll date has no problem with me flying her to Cancun, but has a problem with what I say on my YouTube channel. And I'm like, that is not alignment. You have to be completely and 100% in alignment with what I'm doing. Just like if you were to date a girl who was opposed to plastic surgery, it doesn't work. She has to be completely.
I don't want to come home to being scolded for the means that have provided all the comforts around it.
Correct. So you understand what I'm saying. That's exactly I've had that issue before where it's like she doesn't understand that the advice I give to Sandeep from New Delhi is different from the advice that I give to Chad Thundercock. There's different advice I give to
Thundercock.
Right. So there's different advice I give to these guys. But when she hears the advice I give to Sandeep, she doesn't like the fact that her boyfriend is giving that advice, and I'm like, no.
What is it that she's opposed to that?
So there's a couple things. Like for instance, if a girl doesn't call you back, I'm really big on if a girl doesn't call you back,
move on.
Well, it's not just move on, but it's like show that you're living a better life. Like go on and post stories.
The philosophy and psychology behind that is that you're not so available.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And you have other options. And one thing that really, and I think you do this well with the guys you work with, is that when you're rejected by a woman, which I don't care who you are, every guy gets rejected.
Exactly.
Listen, I had a friend who was a supermodel. He's the guy they based the Zoolander movie after, and he got rejected once, and like when I was with him, and he's like, it's normal, it happens, right? But the Sandeeps of the world, they need somebody to kind of tell them, like, look, this is the way out of this mental pathway of being, down on yourself. Be a friend to yourself. Feel good about yourself. Put yourself in a situation where you don't care so much about whether or not that girl calls you back. And the chances are,
abundance.
A week later, they may call you back, especially if they see you walking around with some other attractive woman.
Yes.
Right?
Again, so what you said, you and I know to be true. The concept is called mate choice copying in humans and evolutionary psychology, or pre-selection. If you're dating a woman and you say, hey, part of the reason why you like me is because you saw other women like me. Then she's like, that's not true. It's like, that is true. Again, I love her. She's incredible. My ex-girlfriend, I met her at a bikini competition.
Right.
And she's like, she denies that what I'm saying is true, but it's like, when you met me, there were 75 other girls there. And she doesn't conceive of what I'm saying, but part of the reason why women she
didn't understand the environment of selection there.
Right, but she has a bias against the idea that she's attracted to a man because other women are attracted to him.
Well, I'll tell you an interesting story. When I was growing up, there was some of the wives of these, notorious people would get together in Staten Island.
Yeah.
And some of my classmates, their last names were the names that you see on the History Channel.
Yeah.
Right. And I remember this one time where, in the Italian culture, there's this thing called a Gumar, right? Mm-hmm. And you watch The Sopranos.
The Friday night. You take the Gumas out on Friday night.
Right, right. And so what Gumar comes from is this word comadre, which is cousin.
Yeah.
Right. So when these guys would get caught with this young girl, and they say, "Hey, Anthony, who's this girl?" He's like, "Oh, this is my cousin Susie." Right. And then it gets bastardized into this word Gumar. Right. A lot of these gangsters' wives, right, would accept the fact that these guys were providing and they had this stable home. And maybe they had 2 or 3 kids, and they were, in their 50s, and the sexual attractiveness, the sexual attraction that the woman had towards him declined because her hormones went down.
Yeah.
But they were smart enough to know that in some way that messing with the system would potentially put them out. Now, in Italian culture, you never really got divorced.
Yeah.
But you wanted your man happy.
Yeah.
You wanted him to come home, be a good father, be a good husband. So a lot of these women accepted that their husbands had gumas on the side.
Yeah.
I remember one conversation, I don't know, it was at where I went to school. These women were sitting around, and one of them asked one of the women, goes, "Does your husband have a guma?" And she said no. And they all go, "Oh my God, why not? What's wrong? What's wrong with this guy?"
What do you mean he doesn't have a girlfriend on the side?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that struck me so hard as a kid. I was like, what is going on here? And it was the fact that that woman's husband did not seem to be desirable enough to attract a younger woman.
Yeah.
And these women were proud of the fact that their husbands had young girls that were attracted to them in some way, subconsciously. There's an old joke with John Cleese from Monty Python, right? And he's talking to his wife. They're very British. They're sitting there at the table, and he's eating, and he says, I've been having an affair. And the wife goes, "Oh, with who?" And he's like, "Well, that dancer from the show down on 34th Street." And she goes, "Really?" And he goes, "Yeah, well, John in accounting also has an affair with one too." And she goes, "I want to see this woman." So he takes her down to the show, and they're sitting there with their opera glasses on. And, and the wife goes, "Okay, which one is yours?" And he goes, "The blonde one all the way on the left." And she goes, "And which one is John's?" And he goes, "The brunette, to the third one from the right." She goes, "Ours is better, dear." And that captivates and captures that idea.
Yeah, exactly.
And not to say that infidelity is a good thing, but I think that at some point, if you look through history, the idea that men having multiple partners is built into certain societies.
Yeah.
You see it in Japanese culture, in geisha society.
Yeah.
You see it in ancient Roman society, right? They had these temples to the goddesses, which were basically our equivalent of strip clubs today.
Yeah.
And in Las Vegas, we have that as well. The reason why Las Vegas grew, Michael, is not because we're in the middle of a desert, but what it was the convention industry, right? And these companies from Detroit and Ohio or IBM, they would take all their predominantly male workforce out for a convention in a city that had all these sort of social vices around.
Yeah.
Right? And they would have access to all these different things. And then they would that was the best trip of the year. They'd come home happy to their wife.
Yeah.
They wouldn't talk about what they probably did. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas.
Yeah.
That's our moniker. But that industry of travel and tourism grew up around the idea that this is a social pop-off valve, right? I say Las Vegas is the closest thing that we've gotten to ancient Rome.
Oh yeah, I agree. There probably are places that are more hedonistic than this.
But Rome wasn't all hedonism, right?
Right.
But we have ancient Rome had the Circus Maximus, right?
Sure.
We have Circus, which is a decrepit hotel, but we now have F1, and we have the track, up north, right? We have the Las Vegas Motor Speedway. Ancient Rome had the gladiator sports.
Yeah.
We have UFC, right? Ancient Rome had the temples to the goddesses. We have the strip clubs. Ancient Rome had the bacchanal feasts. We have a buffet called the Bacchanal. In fact, we have a hotel named Caesar's Palace built on the idea that this is a place in which social vices can be aired out in a acceptable way. Gambling, sex, rock and roll lifestyle. You can get in a fighter pilot suit, fly a fighter jet, or you can go move heavy earth equipment. There's a company that you drive huge backhoes. Right? There's something for everybody here to let either the adult child out or let the social vices run wild in a controlled manner. Probably
the most variety of firearms that you can fire at any city in the entire world.
Listen, that's the Second Amendment. This is why we have freedom of speech.
You can fire a 50 caliber Barrett. It's just crazy.
No,
the
you
weapons.
can actually go up in a helicopter.
Yes.
A patient of mine, had this armory,
Yeah.
and he had a minigun, and he finally strapped it onto a helicopter, a Huey that he had bought at surplus that still flies. You go up there and you could shoot. I think it's like it's 100 rounds, like 60 rounds a minute. It's like 350 a round. You know, you can pull that trigger as long as you want, as long as they have it. You can do it. You could drive a tank in the city.
Yeah.
Right. Not in the city, but you can go outside the city. You can take these off-road trucks that they drive in Baja races and go jump them out in the field. There's no place like this on earth at this time, right? And you know, I remember when I was at UPenn, I did my general surgery at UPenn, and I was doing research at the gene therapy lab there, and I had worked on some patents and stuff like that with some of the surgeons there. And many years later, I got a call from one of my my mentors over there. He said, "All right, hey, Chris, you know, I'm looking for those diagrams of that thing we were working on." He goes, "Where are you at?" I go, "Oh, I'm in Vegas." He goes, "On a vacation?" I go, "No, I moved here." He goes, "What? What happened?" He goes, "What the fuck? What are you doing out in Vegas?" I was like, "Why aren't you at like some like Ivy League institution?" I go, "Oh, you know, life takes you in different directions."
Yeah.
He couldn't fathom that I had, you know, set up shop here.
Yeah, my friends have a hard time with this too. They're like, "How do you live here?" And I'm like,
You
"It's
know,
great living here."
It's really a city full of action. But you know, as a person like you and I are, we're very like we're like evolutionary psychologists. We're biologists. We look at things like David Attenborough.
Yeah.
Right? I love going out, and one of my favorite things would be in the Encore was to sit at the, I think it's the East Side Bar.
Yes.
Right. And so what would happen is at night, people would come in groups to go to XS, which, you know, 15 years ago was the hottest place in town.
It's still the hottest place in town, probably. Yeah.
I don't know. I
Pretty
mean, like,
close.
yeah, it's debatable, right?
Yeah.
It's I love the Win. I love all that stuff. But, you know,
Omnia, XS.
there's no number one. I mean, it
Zouk,
depends on who's playing that night, right? But I used to sit at this bar and I'd watch these groups of people walking by going into the clubs. It was really fun to watch them because depending on what part of the world they're from, you can kind of pick out who they were by how they were dressed. You would see all the women dressed in a certain way, and then you see another group of women who all had the same clothes. It was just an experiment. You feel like a little bird on a perch watching human behavior in a way that you don't get to see anywhere else.
Yeah.
And if you're not sucked into the city, like you're not a degenerate gambler, you're not, you know, substance abusing, you have a handle on stuff, you get to kind of like walk among this is a circus in a sense. You get to be at the carnival all the time, and you get to leave when you want it. You go home, and I live out in the suburbs. It's so peaceful. It's surrounded by nature. It's what, you know, I think of when I think of an oasis, a solitude. It's beautiful. The city has both, but we're lucky. We get to see this show right in front of us, and I can't think of a better place to see it from.
Yeah, it's so great. I told Satoshi Kanazawa, he's a evolutionary psychologist in London, and he and I had an email correspondence, and I was like, "This is the ultimate evolutionary psychology experiment. This is the men with the most money and the most status trying to pick up the youngest, blondest women with the biggest boobs. Like this is the apex of the experiment." That's the way
we see women coming here from all over to be picked up.
Yeah.
Right. Or, you know, they work in the nightlife industry, and it's kind of like a sort of ramp to something bigger. I mean, I've had patients that are bartenders in, you know, high-end restaurants, and, you know, I remember one specifically that, you know, she had really deflated breasts. She was very fit, tall. She had a very, you know, attractive, you know, look to her, but her breasts were completely deflated from being fit.
Yeah.
And a couple of times, you know, I was at the bar and like having dinner there, and they'd say, you know, you should think about breast implants.
Yeah.
Right. And she's like, I'm all natural. I don't do that. It's like, okay, I'm not gonna sell you. But like, finally,
you can get away with that better than I can.
Finally, well, yeah, I get away with a lot of things. I mean, like, finally, I had done 2 of her coworkers.
Yeah.
Right. And she finally came in the office.
Yeah.
And I put in breast implants. And you know, Michael, within 6 months, she was on private jets at St. Bart's. she was at the Kentucky Derby.
Yeah.
She was no longer bartending.
Yeah.
You know, she had her lifestyle had become elevated, right? And you think about what a small change. Now, I'm certain that there were other factors, but then she came in and said, "This was the best investment I ever made because you were right. This changed the way men looked at me at the bar, and I got more opportunity from this than anything else."
Yeah.
And so, you know, it works in both directions, right?
Yeah.
You know, appearance is so vital to interaction as humans. And I'll tell you, I was in a store recently, and I did a lot of congenital surgery on children, like with facial deformities in my training. And I was in a store in town here, and they have a very liberal sort of mentality. They have very kind of like diverse workforce. And there was a person there who had a Tessier type 3 facial cleft, which is this big sort of involution of the face on the right side. It kind of goes through the eye socket. It's really tough, right? Even as a plastic surgeon, I was interacting with this person. I found it difficult, right? Not because, I was judging the person.
Yeah.
They were exceptionally adept at answering the questions. They were incredibly good at their job, but I was distracted.
Yeah,
right?
of course.
Because the normative appearance of a person is something we take for granted. And even as a trained professional who knew exactly why this person had this issue, I felt uncomfortable in a way.
Yeah.
Because I felt sympathetic to them. I had a lot of emotions kind of
Yeah.
like going through my head. This person really had to work hard to get to this position. And I'm distracted by that notion. Now, if I had to interact with them on a regular basis, that would probably diminish. But on my one-to-one, face value, prima facie, it was difficult. And that's reality. Right? We are not programmed. We are not born this way. We're genetically programmed this way.
Yeah.
And it's not something you can immediately change. Right?
Yeah. So this was actually the first thing I was going to ask you about. So you and I, we had a conversation with a female friend of mine, and it was about, so you remember back in the 90s, breast implants were crapshoots. Like they really were.
Yeah, they were made by Dow Corning, the company that made the screen on your iPhone.
It was pretty, like you would see really great breast implants, and then you would see, because I used to work at a strip club back in like 99, 2000.
Did you do the DJ, like, please welcome to this?
Yeah.
You got that voice.
Yeah, I was a DJ at a strip club for like 4 years.
Please put your hands together, right?
I would say crazy
come
shit.
on,
like cinnamon, stage 2, cinnamon.
You got that whole inflection down perfectly.
It's like, where is cinnamon?
The warm welcome for Trinity.
I tried to not be the stereotypical strip club DJ, but it was, I really I tried to be funny. I tried to almost do like stand up.
Okay. I mean,
anyway, I remember, and then learning more about it. Like some women, just the implant sits in different places. They have different shape, rib cages, et cetera, et cetera. And then we were having a conversation with one lady, and because of how the implant sat, you could put fat on the outside or the inside and then change it, because if you pushed them in too far, then the nipples would face out or vice versa.
Right.
And then we got into the discussion about transferring fat from a cadaver, and you're like, well, as of right now, that really isn't a thing.
Yeah, I used to always get patients come in as usually one fat sister, one skinny sister.
Yeah.
Fat sister wants to get rid of the fat. The skinny sister wants more fat. And they go, well, can my sister give me her fat? And the answer was no. And they would say, why?
Yeah. So, from my understanding, because I had actually looked up, so for instance, a heart transplant, there's a rejection medication you have to take because
tacrolimus,
correct,
Celebs, these really tough drugs. Yeah.
Yeah. So you would have to do that because you're taking DNA from two different sources, and you have to have mitosis between the two organs, and so organ transplants are difficult because of that.
Well, those are solid tissue organs.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a big thing with solid organs that has a lot of gene expression on it.
Yeah.
So what you're asking is like, why can't we transfer other people's fat?
And then how did you figure this out? So because apparently aloe clay, you're taking a different genetic source, and then also it's sterilized. I don't really understand. How is it that you're able to make this whole thing work?
You're talking about aloe clay.
Yeah.
It's a product that I've spent the last 5 years developing.
Yeah.
And this is kind of funny because the guys at Penn were like, you never do anything to change the world. You never, because I was working in gene therapy. We were supposed to, make big differences, and I left to be a plastic surgeon. So I've never given up on that. Science has always been, cornerstone of my life. And even though I live in Las Vegas, I do things that, advance our field. And I've been, known as an innovator in plastic surgery for, almost 2 decades. Right. So when it came down to it, we see a lot of girls in this town who go into these hotel rooms and get, illegal industrial fillers put in their butts and their hips. And they have devastating, both emotional and physical consequences. I have seen it firsthand. And yet you say, well, why did you do this? And there's this desire to change the form into something that they feel is more incongruity with their internal psyche. Right?
Yeah.
So fat has always been a cornerstone of volumization in the body. And for 30, 40 years, we've been doing fat transfers where you liposuction fat out of one part of your body, and in the same setting, same OR, same time, re-inject it into another place.
And the reason why that works is because it's the same DNA also.
Yeah, that's where BBLs came from.
Correct.
Right?
But the BBL works because you have the same 23 alleles, but it's just in a different part of the body, which is what you can't do when you transfer from one person to another. It's not like, I know you can do
that's an autologous, what we call it, this is the terminology, it's autologous transplant.
Yeah.
Right? But we in medicine have been using what we call allografts, right? Allo comes from others, right? And so it's ALLO. It's a Greek precursor. It's a Greek word, meaning similar. And so allografts are grafts from other people. And where do you see this? Well, we in orthopedics, we use bone grafts all the time. Where do you think those bone grafts come from? They come from donor tissue.
Yeah.
Right? We have, for the last 25, 30 years, used allogeneic skin grafts, right?
Yeah.
Meaning there's in your body, you have the epidermis and the dermis,
Yeah.
right? And you can take all the cells out of the dermis, wash them out, and you're left with a collagen structural framework. We've been using that to repair hernias. We've been using that for burn patients. We've been using it as slings within the body for different suspensory issues, because the body looks at this thing. It's called the graft-host interaction, right? And when you get something that's close enough, similar enough, without a lot of gene expression on it, the body just says, "Oh, it's just like me. I'm going to incorporate it." So this is the difference.
This is why you can do an Achilles tendon from a cadaver.
Right. So when you rupture your Achilles tendon, and if it's really in bad shape, you may need a tendon graft, right?
Yeah.
Where does that tendon come from? That tendon comes from a donor tissue, which means somebody, at the time of their death, designates that the parts of their body can be used for medical purposes so that they can help other people, right? Organ donors, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? But the difference between a solid organ, right, is that organs now have living cells that are still going to be living when they get transplanted to the person. And solid organs have a lot of gene expression on the cells, and they still maintain the genetic machinery inside. You need all that for an organ to work, for the heart to continue pumping. But to make it work in another person, you take immunosuppressive drugs, Celebs, tacrolimus, different
because your immune system would see it as not the cell.
It would want to reject it.
Correct. Got it.
Now, one of the organs that my third year, I was bestowed upon me the title of transplant fellow, because the fellow at UPenn got his visa held up. He was coming from Oxford, and it was like an ignominious title, because the transplant fellow would never leave the hospital, literally.
Yeah.
So I spent the better part of August and September living at Hospital University of Pennsylvania doing organ transplants. In the liver, when we transplant that tissue, you've got a ton of gene expression. So prior to receiving that transplant, you need to go through HLA typing. HLA is the marker of compatibility that expresses on all cells, right? HLA is basically saying, this is my genetic fingerprint on the surface of my cell to say whether it's from me or from someone else. Now, you always look for an HLA match type of, there's like 15 or 17 that we look at. It's been a while since I've done transplant, but we look at these markers and say, how many of them are matched up close enough where we can put this organ in this other person and it's going to think it's its own. And maybe we have to give a little kind of immune suppression to keep those other cells from lurking around and say, hey, this is not us. Yeah. That's what solid organ transplant's all about. When you do a tendon transplant, an allogeneic graft, right? The tendon is not living tissue, right? But it has the structural framework of the tissue that you are seeking, right? There's no great synthetic substitute for a tendon, right? But if we get the framework in and we get that scaffolding in, your body's going to react to that in what we call the graft-host response, right? And it's going to integrate that into the body through a repair mechanism, right? And so with AlloClay, which is the product that I've been working on for 5 years with Tiger Aesthetics, we basically figured out something different. Okay, so fat doesn't express a lot of HLA, markers on the surface. So genetically, it's not an immunogenetic type of tissue.
Not as troublesome.
It's not as inflammatory, but lipids inside the fat can be. It's a different story. When you transfer a tendon, right, it has about 5,000 nanograms per milligram of DNA in the tissue, which is quite a bit. Fat is much lower, but this is where the breakthrough came in with AlloClay. And this is kind of like the Alexander Fleming moment. I knew somehow we can make this work, and I had been working on this 2 years before the guys from Tiger came to me with another company, and they folded. When they came to me, they said, they were in the wound care business, right? And they were doing placental wound grafts, and they had a lot of experience with, graft interaction and seeing what taking the placenta can do when you apply it to a wound. It accelerates wound healing, by a massive factor, and it can close wounds that couldn't be closed before. I was doing work on fetal wound healing back at Penn, where if you operate on a fetus in the womb and they are born, they have no scar. So this guy, Michael Longacre, who was on the championship team with Magic Johnson at the University of Michigan.
Yeah.
He hit the genetic lottery, right? He's a great basketball player. He's tall and he's brilliant. He's the head of Stanford's plastic surgery division for research. We're working on. I did a chapter with wound healing. We're trying to figure out all this stuff years ago. The guys that came in for alloclay, they knew about graft-host interaction, and they had access to all this fat. And they said, Chris, at this time, I've been lecturing all around the world. I was in Russia lecturing, I was in Europe lecturing, I was in the United States lecturing, I was giving talks on different aspects of fat grafting and healing. And so they came to me, knocked on the door, and they said, what do we do with this fat that we have? And I said, well, I have ideas. I mean, we need to figure out how to get it to be accepted. In the process of preparing this tissue, this donor fat tissue, I stumbled upon a method that allowed us to remove most of the DNA without disrupting the cells, right? And that is a breakthrough in tissue engineering. So what we're able to do is now in comparison, tendon has about 5,000 nanograms per milligram of DNA. The alloclay product has less than 50. And in some of our batches, we have 0 detectable DNA. The goal over a long term is to be at 0 for everything, but we're far, far below the acceptable standards for DNA in a tissue graft. Right? The other thing that happens, so we proprietarily discovered a way to remove the DNA without rupturing the cells, which is, when I presented this the first time, I'll never forget, I presented at our national meeting. And somebody stood up in the audience. It was like a medieval lynching, sorcery. They could not believe that this was possible. And you go, well, how did you do this? And I was really annoyed by this disruption. I was like, I took a little tweezer and I hand plucked every one of those nuclei just to throw it back at the guy. I go, I'm not telling you right now. It'll be in our paper, which just got published. And so we figured out the method of doing that. We removed most of the DNA, and then at the terminal stage, before the packaging is complete, it goes through a gamma radiation cycle. Which gamma radiation, it sounds horrible, but it's used in all medical devices.
Yes.
Right? It's used to sterilize all tissue products.
Right.
And what it is, it introduces, if there's DNA left, whether it's viral, bacterial, or intrinsic to that cell, that radiation induces fractures in the DNA that render it dysfunctional.
Inert. Yeah.
Inert.
Yeah.
Right. And so the breakthrough has been being able to nearly,
I thought the sterilization was for bacteria. The sterilization was actually for the DNA.
No, the sterilization was for the bacteria.
Okay.
But the question is, with those 50 nanograms per milligram or less, which is it's so hard to even quantify that, right?
Yeah.
That's if those things are still there, they're not functional in any way.
If the DNA is fractured enough, then there's nothing for the body to reject.
Well, DNA is a source code, right?
Yeah.
It's got to be read like a ticker tape, right? And if it's fractured in all these different ways, the body just doesn't read it. The mechanisms for reading DNA are your ribosomes. Your ribosomes take this ticker tape, they run it through this 2-protein thing, and from the ribosomes you get protein production. So the GTAC, the code of the DNA, as it runs through in that order, your ribosomes say, okay, give me this amino acid, that amino acid, stack this here. That's how all biology works.
Yeah.
Right. If the DNA is fragmented, it doesn't get fed into the apparatus.
But is there still mitosis in the fat cells?
The cells are not living.
They just stay. Oh, they're not living. They just stay there. Okay.
No. These are cytoplasmic adipocytes.
Okay.
Which means that they have the membrane around the fat cell. They have the internal lipid that's in the fat cell. But they, for the most part, don't have a nucleus. Almost, the significant percentage. When we try to quantify, it's really hard because almost none.
Yeah.
Right. We don't want to say 0 because we want to stay within guidelines.
Yeah.
But the fact is, it's in some samples undetected. Right. As in comparison, where you have massive amounts in tendon grafts, massive amounts in bone grafts, almost undetectable. Right. Then we radiate it to get rid of any potential contamination before it's finally when it's packaged. Once it's packaged, it gets radiated and then sent out. Right? That radiation kills anything that's in there, right? So it's inert. The other thing that the product has is what's, the extracellular matrix. So it's not just the fat cells, it's all the structures that suspend the fat cells in your body, right? And there's this whole, milieu of proteins, right? The proteomics, it includes collagen, elastin, and laminins, which make up the structure of our body, right? And through the processing, we're able to, get a little higher concentration than normal autologous fat, which we suck from ourselves and put somewhere else. So we've got this kind of like supercharged graft material. And what's amazing is that, I've got patients a year out, and we did extensive animal testing. Like, I hate to say that because, you get these people, it's part of the medical science. They weren't harmed. We just gave some mice some breasts. That's basically what we did, But at the end of the day, we went through all the clinical science of this, through Ames testing, through, co-incubation, everything scientific related to the development of this tissue product. And we found that it was, beneficial and safe in every one of our tests, right? Today we have, I think, our initial launch, we kept it as a soft launch, because we didn't want this, going into the med spas right away, because we don't have, what we did is we got surgeons who had experience in fat grafting, and we allowed them to have access to the product. And, we have, I guess at this point, several thousand patients treated, and, getting all the feedback, it's resoundingly positive. I mean, we have had little to no, adverse effects, adverse events. I mean, you get your normal things where people are being stupid and they go in the jacuzzi the night of the procedure and they get a localized wound infection, but that has nothing to do with the graft, right? What we're seeing is massive graft acceptance, very little graft breakdown, and we're getting what appears to be integration in a way that is almost indistinguishable from the surrounding tissue.
So what happens? So we're talking a fat injection, say around a breast implant or BBL or something like that.
So I do that right now when I have patients who have very little tissue around the breast implant.
Yeah.
Those are your fitness models or people who have had a couple kids and the tissue thins out. So we'll take their love handle fat, inject it over the implant, and give that breast a much more natural feel.
Yeah.
Smaller implant, more volume.
Yeah.
Right? What we do with the alloclay, we could do the same thing, right? But you don't have to undergo surgery now. I mean, it's a procedure, but I don't have to harvest the fat, which comes with problems.
Sure.
Right? When you are, and I used to teach liposuction. I used to teach high-def liposuction, which is like sculpting of the body.
Sure.
I stopped doing it because you can't teach people aesthetics.
Yeah.
Right? So liposuction is the easiest surgery for a surgeon to do, the hardest to master. Because you could take this little tube and suck fat out like a Hoover vacuum, but if you're going to do it and make it look good, that's a whole different art.
Yeah.
Right? And so with most fat grafting, autologous fat grafting today, you have to depend on the doctor who's taking the fat to know how to take the fat properly.
Yes, because the fascia has to reattach or the skin has to reattach.
It's just shaping it. Like, you don't want to take the whole thing from one area. You want to also complement the surrounding tissue so you don't leave what we call a secondary defect. Right? Plus, in all fat grafting procedures, there's two surgery sites, right? You're taking it from here, you put it there.
Yeah.
Two surgical sites, two potential areas for problems, right? The area that patients complain of pain from the most in a fat transfer procedure is where it's harvested from.
Yeah.
The BBL patients almost never complain about their butt hurting. It's about their rest of their body where you scrape the fat from. So if you eliminate that problem of the pain, the downtime, the extensive surgical procedure, most of the time you take a patient to the OR, put them on general anesthesia to harvest the fat, right? You don't have to do that with alloclay. It's off the shelf, on demand, volume, when you need it. And this is going to be a paradigm shift. We already see it, that people are, any new idea comes with a lot of pushback, right? And that was the...
Of course, yeah.
We had a saying at the genetics lab at UPenn, the pioneers get all the arrows, the settlers get all the land.
Yeah.
And that's been, true for most of my career, like pushing the limits of, our art, you get criticized for things. We do it safely. And it's always the funny thing. I would lecture on something, right? And I remember I was giving a lecture on some topic, and it was a multidisciplinary conference with dermatologists, and there was gasps in the air. Like after I said what I did, it was using a filler product at large volumes. And then the next year, I was invited back to teach how to do this because all these dermatologists were like, now they took it as their own. And today it's like, it was polyallactic acid, which is the commercial name is Sculptra. But I think I gave the first presentation on using large volume Sculptra to enhance body contouring. It doesn't work. In my estimation, it never had the results that I really wanted.
Yeah.
And I've done patients with 100 vials, 150 vials. Some of these people you may know, right? And with no significant improvement in volume in the body contour. They're smart enough to know not to go to a hotel room and get industrial bullshit injected into them, right? But they're looking for a solution. And one of these patients I recently treated with alloclay, and they're like, this has been the miracle that I've been waiting for a decade. They're a super lean person. They have no fat to give, right? They needed volume in certain areas for their self-esteem, for their sense of well-being. I don't judge that. I don't make up the rules. But when a person looks in the mirror and sees something they don't like, and there's an option to change it, right? Rather than changing your mindset, you can do both, right? But if you can change a part of your body that bothers you easily and safely, why not do it? Those patients, now come back and say, when can I do another round of alloplay?
Yeah.
The other beauty of alloplay is like when I was doing BBLs, right? And it's not to say you can do a full BBL with alloplay at this point.
Yeah.
These syringes are 12.5 cc's of shelf-stable adipose tissue graft. And you can get them in a dual package where it's 25 cc's, right? So you could do, right now we're doing up to 50, 100 cc's per side.
This would work for like ripples on breast implants.
100%.
Yeah, or something like that.
Yeah, and so what you're able to do is layer down a tissue that then gets integrated by the body, accepted as almost like its own, and you have this graft-host interaction, and it gets integrated into the body in a way that's natural. So you're not putting chemicals in there. You're not putting a sugar that's going to cause inflammatory reactions. A lot of the stuff that we have been doing in plastic surgery is now showing to cause long-term side effects, like hyaluronic acid fillers. We see in studies causing clogging of the lymphatics of the face. You get this puffy filler face, right? The market for that has dropped because Gen Z and millennials are much more aware of what's going on with their bodies than ever before. And nobody, the idea of having a synthetic product in your face is not as attractive as having something that stimulates the graft-host interaction.
Sure.
And your body rebuilds your own body. Right? It's a reparative mechanism that comes along and fills in the tissue in a natural way. We see under microscopy stem cells adhering to the graft immediately within 24 hours and setting up shop and repairing it. It's really groundbreaking stuff. It's really cool.
So I guess my next question, because this is the first thing I thought, was, are there going to be certain ethnicities that you extract fat from that may have more higher quality fat than other people? Do you understand what I'm saying? What I'm asking?
Right now, the tissue is from the tissue banks from the American that are all AATB certified, the American Associated Tissue Banks, which have stringent FDA standards and screening and selection. We don't look at any particular race as more favorable than others. We do have a criteria of cutoff right now. It's between 18 and 70 years old. And certain BMIs over. Right now, our criteria for donor materials is over a BMI of 31. Now, I just met with the team this weekend looking at.
I see.
We looked at is fat any different when you're 70 or 80? And so we have a whole team of biologists. Right now, the project's about 100 scientists working on this.
So this was my I was thinking of the economics of this. You remember the whole thing in. What's it called in Fight Club when they're selling back their own fat? They take the.
I guess it's kind of it's interesting.
The liposuction.
Here I am sitting here with Tyler Durden glasses on, right? And it sounds funny. The reality is there's a lot of science and there's an ethically there's an ethical mentality about this. We're not running around the back of lipo clinics stealing the fat, right?
Yeah.
And this is not. These are all donor directed. They go through the American Associated Tissue Bank criteria for screening.
Well, that's what I'm asking is, could we get to a point where they're getting paid to do liposuction? Do you understand what I'm asking?
That's a different problem, right? And so the FDA highly regulates any tissue products that come out of a patient. So right next to my office, right, as fate should have it, there is a cryogenic tissue bank.
Yeah.
Right. You can't make this up, right? And I had looked at so many different ways of banking patients' fat for later use.
Yeah.
Well, the second the fat comes out of the body and you don't place it back in the surgery center and you put in storage, the FDA views it as a therapeutic agent and they have purview over it. So if it leaves the OR, it's no longer theirs. They have a control over that. And so there are restrictions on being able to do that in the United States. It may happen elsewhere where people take their fat, they bank it, and you can bank your fat, but to put it back in.
But where does the fat come from though for the alloclay? I don't understand. Describe are these people who came in for liposuction or
no. These are tissue donors. These are people who have expired and their family.
Oh, okay, got it.
They've made the gift of life.
Yeah.
Right. When we look at this, it's the gift of life.
Yeah.
Right. And so, one of the things that you have to consider is plastic surgery is not all just making butts and breasts bigger.
Yeah.
There's a whole spectrum of deformity that we treat. There's a whole spectrum of reconstruction that we treat. And when we look at post-mastectomy breast reconstruction in the United States, insurance companies have basically, eliminated tissue-based reconstructions effectively. You could still get them, meaning that there's a procedure called tram flap or a DF flap, where I take a tummy tuck paddle and I cut the tissue I was going to take out and throw away from a tummy tuck. I could take the artery and vein and plant it into the chest and create a breast mount with it. I did hundreds of these in training.
Yeah.
They take hours to do, right? The team I was with, we knock them out pretty quick because we're really good at it. But most teams that do a bilateral DF flap, it takes 12 to 15 hours to do the surgery, and then they're in the ICU monitoring this. Most insurances won't pay for this.
As opposed to breast implants.
Yeah, breast implant. You put an implant in, you cover it with muscle. Maybe you put an allogeneic dermal sling over it, and you cover the whole implant. And they're more willing to do that. You'll put a tissue expander in, stretch out the tissue, come out every 90 days to the office, put more saline in until you expand that tissue compartment where the breast used to be. All that tissue's gone now. You have to expand that tissue to make a pocket. And then after about 6 to 9 months, you exchange that tissue expander for a final implant. The problem with that, Michael, is that all you're left with is skin, muscle, and implant.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily approximate what a breast is.
Yeah.
A breast has a lot of connotation to it. A lot of feminine identity is tied to the breast. Now, I had to get a wisdom tooth pulled. I've had all my wisdom teeth in. They came in naturally. They came in straight. And I had to get one pulled because I cracked it one day, right? It sounds stupid, but when that tooth was gone, I felt like a part of me was gone, right? And that's just my tooth that I don't need. I can't imagine, because I'm not a woman, what it feels like to lose such an identifiable part of your femininity.
Yeah.
Right? And the replacement of it is this approximation of what your breast used to be. It's an implant, which is hard, underneath a tissue covering, which is there's no softness to the breast. So what Aloclay provides is the ability to increase that cushioning over that deeper structure, little by little, in a very controlled way, in an office setting. A little bit of, we still treat this as a sterile field, but it's more like a syringe injection than a surgery. And now we can look at sequentially adding that tissue over time until the patient is satisfied, right? It used to be every time you wanted to add fat over a reconstructed breast, we had to take them back to the OR, harvest more fat from somewhere, and then re-inject it. That's cost, time, downtime from work.
Yeah.
With Aloclay, my patients are back to work the next day.
Yeah.
Right? The pain is minimal. I usually tell them just stay out of the water for about a week to 2 weeks.
How big is this syringe? Like 25 gauge? Like how?
Well, it's a cannula. So a cannula is a hollow tube with an opening on the end, and it's a blunt tip. So the cannula is 1.8 millimeters, right? So we make a small nick in the skin. And then the way I dress is with a little butterfly strip, and we come back in like 2 days, it's barely an incision.
Oh, wow. Incredible.
Yeah. And so this used to be much more invasive.
Yeah.
But, when you give the gift of life, you give organs, you give bone, you give tissue. And a lot of people do this. Some of it's for financial reasons because you get remuneration for it so that you can pay for your funeral expenses.
Yeah.
The funeral business is just the most horrible thing. If you've ever had to, go through that.
I know a guy who owns a funeral parlor. During COVID, he was like, "Yeah, we didn't have a recession like everybody else."
Oh my God, it's predatory in some sense because you're at the worst part of your life, and they're saying, wouldn't you want your family to have the upgraded, coffin?" You're like, "I guess so. I don't know." But at that time, even just simple burial procedures cost thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
Right. And many people don't have the insurance. What happens if and it's not like we take everything and you don't get anything. There are parts that they'll agree to donating.
Yeah.
And then you go back and it pays for your funeral expenses or your cremation if that's what you choose for. But it's a gift. What I call the gift of life.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, that donation, especially when I was in the transplant service, we would talk to these families who would have a young male who was on life support, whether they were brain dead from a gunshot or a horrific accident. And, one of the things that we would reassure the family is that their loved one would in some way live on by helping that person. And we started this conversation about the value of self-image, right? And I think that it's betrayed by media so much because it's exaggerated. But when you don't feel good about the way you look, you have a lesser effect in society. My whole goal is to be able to provide people the option, if they so want, to find a way to reshape their body, to mold the clay of their body into something that makes them feel able to go into society and be effective. To not feel ashamed of the way they look, to not feel lesser than, to not feel like they're in the 1, 2, 3 category of the black pill.
Sure.
Right? That's to me part of my mission in life, right? I want people to feel good about themselves. I want people to go out into society and feel comfortable in their bodies. Because when you are feeling good about yourself, you do good things in this world, right? You're not resentful of others.
Yeah, of course.
You walk out of the world and you want to help other people because you have an abundance inside you. I mean, the goal of this is to create a better world, right?
Yeah.
In a sense, by doing this one patient at a time, by restoring what Mother Nature had left out or misfortune had taken away. So it's a big project. I think, you know, if the company had 25,000 units on the shelf, they would be gone by the end of the day.
Wow.
You know, the demand for this has far outstripped our production at this moment, but that doesn't mean that that's ongoing. We did this strategically to be safe, to make sure we got this in the hand of skilled clinicians who can give us good feedback. And, you know, the cases are, you know, I don't know the exact number. We're about maybe 2,000 cases over the past 6 months. And we have great feedback.
When was it approved? It was just in this last year.
So the tissue approval process is different than a pharmaceutical drug or a medical device. So in homologous use, which means like for like, tissue transfer, as long as you maintain a minimal manipulation guideline, you maintain safety standards on cleanliness, biological load, packaging, and you follow packaging and guidelines for manufacturing, as long as you don't manipulate the tissue, right, you have a 361 guideline from the FDA that allows you to use it. It's different than when you have to do multi-phase clinical studies. Would you say, well, why are they so lax about this? They're not. We're building on 40, 50 years of clinical evidence. And it's really hard to do a typical study that you do for a pharmaceutical drug because there's not when you do a pharmaceutical drug study, you do a placebo side by side. First, you do preclinical testing in lab, then you do, you know, phase 2 and phase 3.
Yeah.
But there's no placebo for fat. I can't take you in and inject like some blob of stuff into you and say, well, which one worked better? It doesn't work that way. But the FDA looks at this as saying there is a massive historical amount of data and literature supporting allogeneic grafting. And we follow those guidelines. And to be honest with you, Michael, I mean, there's times when even I'm blown away by the results of this. There's nothing like it out there. And even autologous fat grafting, taking my own fat or taking a patient's own fat and transferring it, I think it has, and we're going to look at this going forward. And so far in my experience, it's more reliable than autologous fat.
Wow. Okay.
Right. Here's a really interesting thing. That dying is an active process.
Yeah.
You need active cell machinery for a cell to die, right? Because when a cell is in trouble, it starts transcribing all these stress proteins.
So if you get rid of that machinery, then the cell can't. Okay, wow. And then not only can it not die, your body doesn't see it as the other. It doesn't. Your immunosuppressant system. Correct. Your immune system does not fight that.
It's a very elegant, sophisticated, and it humbles me. It humbles me because I'll tell you this. I don't think it didn't come from me. It came through me, the idea, right? I knew we were going to get there, right? And every step of the way, it seemed to work better and better, and things worked more and more in our favor. And and at this point, looking back, you know, it's like the Steve Jobs speech at Stanford. You can only connect the dots going backwards. You can't connect the dots going forward.
Yeah.
You have to have faith in something, right? And I had maybe outsized faith in this process. I don't know why. I don't know where, and I don't know where it came from, whether it's the collective subconscious, God, whatever you want to call it. But I had faith from the very beginning that we were going to figure this out and get it done. And here we are. And the outstanding results have exceeded even what my faith had brought me.
Incredible. Man, I could talk about this for another couple hours, man. This is great.
Sure.
Getting to nerd out with you. I was really hoping you'd be technical because that's really what my audience really likes that. So that's really cool. Before we wrap up here, where can people find you? Like, what can you talk? We haven't even talked about VIP plastic surgery at all.
VIP plastic surgery is my practice here in Las Vegas.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been practicing for 18 years, I think, 17 years, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I do cosmetic surgery for men and women.
Yeah.
You know, we do hair transplants. We have VegasHairTransplants.com. We got a lot of guys flying in for it.
Yeah.
I put my work up against anybody's in the world. We have I developed a technique called max density, which I had to reimagine the whole hair transplant procedure from the ground up and figure out, how do we get more hairs per square centimeter? And how do we harvest more hairs per square centimeter? How do we get maximum density? And a lot of the tools that we were using were kind of like outdated. They were used from other things. Some of the concepts that we were using were outdated. And just, just like everything else, right? In my practice, I've always pursued sort of continual improvement of things. So we have VegasHairTransplants.com. VIPPlasticSurgery.com is my main website. Instagram, I'm at docvegas, right? DOCVEGAS. I mean, I don't do as much social media as I used to. And I think social media became a distraction for me from the projects that I was working on. And I felt like I'm not really here to pump my own chest up.
Sure.
I'm here to do the work that other people unwilling or can't do in research. And but I think that men who feel that they need to do something can, right? That there is no genetic lottery that you can't kind of overcome. Okay, we can give you the confidence back, and I see it, right? And so, for the time being, I still maintain my practice. As time goes on, more and more of the calling is in industry to help more people at one time.
Sure.
And going forward with Tiger Aesthetics, I think I'll start to kind of spend more of a management role there. But
okay.
Today, we take care of patients from all around the globe. We have, I think, bar none, some of the best staff in the world. And, there's nothing better than coming to Vegas for a few days and recovering. Like if you want to have plastic surgery here and you go out with a hoodie and a hat on, nobody's going to look at you, right? They don't care. They're more worried about their comps on the slot machine and getting that free buffet, right?
Yeah.
But Vegas is an ideal town because I felt like, we have beautiful women here. My surgery is on display every day. And you see, and Michael, many of my patients.
Of course.
Right?
More than 25.
Yeah. Many of my patients, and the work doesn't hide behind a camera or a filter or whatever. It is a testing ground for good plastic surgery. And if you do good stuff here, people recognize it. So I've had patients come from Dubai. I've had a lot of patients come from LA.
Yeah.
There's this fallacy that, the brain trust of plastic surgery is in Beverly Hills. It's not. But there are great plastic surgeons there. I love what I do. I have a passion for making people's lives better, and I have a lot of tools at my disposal to do that.
Awesome, man. Hey, man, thank you for joining us. I'm really glad to finally have you come out here. This was really good.
Yeah.
We went off, I had, like I said, I had 50 questions.
We got to come back and do some more.
For sure. I had 50 questions lined up, and we got through like 5 of them. It was perfect, though. This was really good.
Listen, we got more time some other
Yes, for sure. And let me return the favor. You should do a podcast.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we'll figure that out in time. I've thought about it. It is my time right now is really dedicated to being a father.
Sure.
Raising kids, taking care of my patients, and innovating.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for joining us, and thank you guys for joining us. We will see you all next week.